initiating, enabling statutory provision for prevailing wages. And so, it's funny, I often get inquiries asking me what's the process for applying for an exemption to prevailing wage laws. And the short answer is there is no process for applying for an exemption. This is a generally applicable law. There are specific exceptions in the labor code, but there are no exemptions one can apply for. So, the law applies to everybody equally, which is a good thing. And this section is applicable to all work performed under contract and not applicable to work carried out by a public agency with its own forces, which means that the force account, employees of the state or a political subdivision, are not subject to prevailing wage laws. Of course, they usually have their own public employee bargain for contracts, so maybe not necessary. And this is the provision that also covers maintenance work. So as I stated, there's, well, let's just move on to the next slide. All right, what is a public work? Construction and the related work, which is done under contract and paid for in any part out of public funds. So the one provision here, which you may find a little confusing, is done under contract. And what that really means is not performed by an agency or political subdivision of the state's own forces, their force account labor. Done under contract means the work is let for contract, and that work is, if the other two prongs of public work are met, is a public works project and subject to prevailing wage requirements, assuming it meets the other requirements, $1,000, et cetera. Okay. So this is the big section of the labor code. 1771 and 1720 are the two main provisions. Oh, I almost forgot. So we're reading, I'm citing to the labor code extensively in this presentation. My office orders many copies of this book every year. At the beginning of the year, it's published. It's very useful. It's a compendium of applicable labor code provisions and the California Code of Regulations and a couple of other code sections. And the reason it's so useful is because every time the labor code's amended as it relates to public works, the amended sections are bolded and italicized, so they're very apparent, and it's a easy reference guide. So if you're regularly engaged in public works and paying prevailing wages, or a contractor who needs to be aware of the relevant provisions of the labor code, I would highly recommend getting prevailing wage laws. This is this year's, but very soon they'll be issuing a 2022, and it's published by the American Council of Engineering Companies. If you go to www.acec-ca.org, you can see that they have publications for sale, and the prevailing wage laws compendium is a very useful book in our office. Okay, so 1720. What does public works mean? It's construction, alteration, demolition, installation, or repair work done under contract and paid for in whole or in part out of public funds. So these various terms are terms of art which cover very specific types of work. Construction, as amended by AB 1768 a couple of years ago, includes pre-construction and post-construction work as well. Alteration refers to a change in character of land primarily. So it's got a very specific definition under the labor code. Demolition involves the dismantling or destruction, demolition of a man-made or woman-made, a person-made structure. And so, you know, we often get inquiries about demolition that involve, you know, earth moving. That's not demolition. It may be alteration or some other or construction, but it's not demolition. Demolition, it's got to be constructed by humans. Installation involves the affixing of an appliance or other item to the realty, as we say. And so that affixing is the kind of hook for public works coverage when it comes to installation. Repair, somewhat self-explanatory, but of course there's some nuance. And maintenance, which is kind of a big one. And that's covered in more specificity, as I read before, 1771, but also Title 8, California Code of Regulations, Section 16,000 has the definition for maintenance, among other things. Next slide, please. Other definitions, specific definitions of public works under 1720A. There's A1, which is construction, alteration, demolition, installation, repair, which I just went over, and A2, work done for an irrigation utility, reclamation, and improvement district, and other districts of this type. This subsection did not get much attention, but recently the California Supreme Court issued an opinion in Kanana versus Barrett Business Services, and you know, the ramifications of that opinion are playing out now, but it involved belt sorters, which were not thought to be covered previously. I should say recycling belt sorters, just in case you were curious. A3 is street, sewer, or other improvement work done under the direction and supervision or by the authority of any officer or public body of the state or any political subdivision or district. So it's very specific, but you know, you should be aware if that kind of work is being performed. Next slide. Very specific definitions: carpet laying, public transportation demonstration projects, infrastructure project grants. I think both 6 and 7 are probably, they're very unique. You probably won't see those, and you'll know it if you're involved. And A8, which is tree removal work done in execution of a project under paragraph 1. So that's important to be aware of, that tree removal done in conjunction with a construction, alteration, demolition, installation, or repair project is covered work as well. Next slide. So paid for in whole or in part of public funds, out of public funds, excuse me. It's 1720B, and this section, so what are public funds? The payment of money or the equivalent of money directly to or on behalf of the public works contractor, subcontractor, or developer. The performance of construction work in the execution of the project. And what that means is, you know, if political subdivision of the state is, or the state itself is performing work in conjunction with a otherwise work conducted by a private entity, that contribution of work has a dollar value, and it should be considered as public funds if we're trying to figure out if the subject project is a public works project. And transfer of an asset of value for less than fair market price. That often comes up in you know, the sale of a parcel of land for a development project, and we've had lots of coverage determinations addressing that issue. You know, if it has value and it's being conveyed to a development project, it may implicate the public works law. So be aware, you know, if it's got value, it may be public funds, and it's crucial to kind of examine that with a clear vision. Next. More fees, costs, rents, insurance, or bond premiums, loans, interest rates, or other obligations that would normally be required in the execution of the contract that are paid, reduced, charged at less than fair market value, waived, or forgiven, money loaned that is to be repaid on a contingent basis, credits that are applied against repayment obligations. So just before I address this slide, you don't need to go back, but you know, it's important. That list I just read from, just about everything that could be characterized as public funds is characterized as public funds in the labor code. You know, contingent loans, which we addressed, if it has value and it's either conveyed on a contingent basis, or you know, the public funds prong of the coverage is very strong. And you know, I've seen many instances where clever people you know, try to formulate a development project that has complex financial arrangements, and you know, we look very carefully at those to try to figure out if public funds are involved. So, you know, be aware, if it has value, it may be a public fund causing coverage under the prevailing wage laws. So the purposes of the prevailing wage law, for purposes of the prevailing wage law, these very specific exceptions apply. Proceeds from conduit revenue bonds, these are usually available to build schools, hospitals, and housing. Also 1720.9, the general acute care hospital provision, you know, if you're involved in that kind of construction project, be aware. And 1720.8, charter school construction. There's also an exception for low income housing tax credits that are part of a development project. And these are usually allocated by the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. If you're involved in development of low income housing, and I know a lot of people are these days, you know, it's important to be aware of all the inputs into the project and whether or not it's a public works project. Okay. Other definitions of public work. 1720E, work on electric transmission systems. 1720.2, private construction leased to a public entity, and I'll cover this a little more. 1720.3 specifically covered the off-hauling of refuse. That section is very specific, and if you're involved in off-hauling of refuse from a public works project, you know, you should be aware of it. Section 1720.6, private renewable energy projects on public property. I was seeing a lot of these a couple of years ago, not so much these days. You know, this comes up. Contractors and vendors were offering to install solar panels on public facilities free of charge, but it may implicate this code section if it's you know, meets the requirements. So that's something to be aware of. That's just one example of what the code section covers, but I just, you know, by way of illustration. Section 1720.7, that I referenced that just a moment ago, acute care hospitals, and also 1720.8, just reference that as well. And finally, a big one, a hot topic a couple of years ago, and probably still today, section 1720.9, the hauling of ready mix concrete. Next. So this is Labor Code section 1720.2. These come up pretty frequently. This is tenant improvements paid for by private landlord. This is the box on the left is just an illustration. There's a private office building with 100,000 total square feet. The city of Sacramento leases 60,000 square feet, and the landlord undertakes improvements of the building for the city of Sacramento to move into. And is this covered work? It is under 1720.2 because more than 50% of the assignable square footage of the office building is being leased to a public entity, and the improvements are undertaken after the lease is signed. So, excuse me, even before the lease is signed, if the tenant improvements are done according to the city's specifications, it may be covered. So, important to be aware of that. These are specific exceptions to the labor code. So the C2, public improvement work required as a condition of regulatory approval, and I'll touch on this in, a little bit more in a moment. And where the project is an otherwise private development, well, I'll touch on it right now, excuse me. The public entity must not contribute more money or the equivalent of money to the overall project than is required to construct the public improvement work, and the public entity must not maintain any proprietary interest in the overall project. So I have a little illustration following. Giant Corp development project, multi-structure development. And in order to gain obtain regulatory approval for the project, Giant Corp went to the city and said, you know, we want to do this huge development project. And the city said, okay, great, go ahead, do it. But in order to do it, you're going to have to, you know, do some sidewalk improvements and install traffic signals. And Giant Corp says, okay, well, you know, are you going to help us out with that? And then the city provides a public subsidy of $8 million for the sidewalk and traffic signal work. Now, the budgeted cost of the sidewalk and signal installation is $10 million. So, so long as the public subsidy does not exceed the amount of the actual work done pursuant to the regulatory approval process, the work is the overall project does not become a public works project. However, the construction of the sidewalk and the signal installation is subject to prevailing wage requirements, and so it's a kind of a unique provision. And you know, if you're involved in a large development project that has specific improvements required as a condition of regulatory approval, should be aware of this provision. 1720 C3A exception. This is de minimis. It applies when a public entity provides a public subsidy to an otherwise private development project that is de minimis in context of the project. C3B has provided us some, and this is a recently enacted section, some clarity. A project is de minimis, or a contribution, excuse me, is de minimis if it is both less than $600,000 and less than 2% of the total project cost. And there's a further for single family dwellings that specifies that it's just less than 2% of the total project costs. And this section is only applicable to projects advertised for bid or awarded before July 1st of 2021. So anything after that date would fall within the 1720 C3B section. This is a very specific exception for affordable housing projects, which, as I said at the outset, it seems like there's a lot of that going on right now. The 2040-80 is a you know, way of remembering how this applies. It's at least 40% of the units are dedicated to affordable housing and made available to households making no more than 80% of the area median income. And these restrictions are in place for at least 20 years. And below market interest rate loan. So very specific, but if you're involved in affording housing development, definitely should be aware of this. Some more miscellaneous exceptions to the Labor Code 1720.4 for volunteers or Conservation Corps. 1720.5, very specific graffiti removal done in the city of Los Angeles, done by a community-based organization under certain circumstances, and this provision accepting the work of janitorial, custodial, and security guard workers is adjacent to the definition for maintenance under California Code of Regulations, Section 16,000. So should be aware. It would be interesting to know what people's takes are on the difference between a janitor and a custodian, but I have my own ideas about that. Next slide, please. So the process for requesting a coverage determination is specified in Labor Code Section 1773.5 and the California Code of Regulations sections 16,001 through 16,002.5. Basically, there are two types of inquiries which form the basis of a coverage determination. Whether a project, the entire project is covered, and that usually I just went over, and whether a type of work is covered. So, for example, the orders that I talked about that were at issue in the Kanana decision, and those really, although you sound simple, but there's a lot of nuance to coverage, and what types of projects may be covered and what type of work is ultimately found to be covered under the Labor Code. Next slide, please. What's a coverage determination? And so the director has the power to determine that a project or a type of work is public work through issuing what is known as a coverage determination, a final determination on an administrative appeal. So the initial coverage determination, and I'd like to say a few words about it actually. If you're submitting a request for a coverage determination under 1773.5 and the enabling regs, there's a need to, in my opinion, and I think everyone in my office would agree that there's a need to include any potentially interested parties in the request. You may want to get a favorable request, excuse me, a favorable determination from my office, from the director, but if all interested parties are not included at the outset, what's going to happen is that there's going to be an administrative appeal where those interested parties will have an opportunity to, submit records and information which may alter the coverage determination. So, there's kind of not really a great benefit to hiding the ball at the outset. It's much better to have all of the information necessary for the director to render a coverage determination provided at the outset. And depending on when the parties make their submissions, the entire process can take many months and often entails some back and forth between the director's office and the various requesting parties and interested parties to the coverage determination. As I went over in the presentation earlier today, especially the public funding components of a potential public works project can be quite complex. And sometimes it takes a little while to get all the necessary records in place, especially if we're talking about a long-term development project or complex funding. So, it's important to be aware that it's not depending on the complexity of the question and the project, it's not necessarily going to be a very, very expeditious process. It can take a little while and some back and forth. So I just wanted to specify a couple of new laws. AB 2231 is the change to the de minimis exception, which I went over, and AB 2765 is work on charter schools funded with proceeds from conduit revenue bonds. That's the new law as well. And if you have the ACEC publication, prevailing wage laws, it will be italicized and bolded in the book, and you can easily identify those new code provisions. Next slide, please. There's been some big recent decisions issued by the California Supreme Court, the Kanana versus Barrett Business Services opinion, which we're still trying to incorporate it into our understanding of applicable prevailing wage public works law. Busker versus Wabtec Corp, which involved the installation of positive train control elements on LA Metro. That and a companion opinion, Mendoza versus Fonseca, involving mobilization work, were both issued very recently, August 16th, 2021, and our office is still analyzing the decisions and trying to figure out how to apply them to public works projects. So but you should be aware, if you're regularly involved in public works and prevailing wage projects, that these are out there. Next. There it is. That's the general email address. I usually provide that. I also usually provide, is there another line on the slide? There's not. I can provide my cell phone number since I'm working from home mostly these days. I'm occasionally in the office, but it's probably best, if you want to reach me directly, to call me on my cell phone. And I'm going to give you my cell phone number right now. But you should be aware, the Thanksgiving holiday is coming up, and it may take me a moment to get back to you, like after Thanksgiving. 510-871-7574 if you have any direct inquiries about the presentation today or coverage. 510-871-7574. And then on the next slide, these are useful links, and the materials are provided, so you should be able to take a look at any of these. I'll put in a plug also for DLSC's Public Works Manual. It's an excellent resource, especially if you're kind of new to the area of prevailing wage law. It's I often still consult, if I've been doing this for a couple of years, still consult the Public Works Manual, because it's it's got a lot of good guidance in it, I would suggest. And you don't have to buy the ACEC publication. You can also go to Cal Ledge Info, and the labor code's there. It's free of charge, and it's printable, or any changes to the law are incorporated into the labor code as it's maintained on that site. And the California Code of Regulations, also important, and maintained by the Office of Administrative Law. So lots of resources here, and you should be aware. I think that's the end of my presentation, and I guess I'm a little early, but that's never a terrible thing.
Thank you so much, Isaac, for your presentation. I think we have time for one or two questions, if that's okay. So I'm going to pass the mic to Joe.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. All right, Isaac, just a couple of questions here, as Daniela mentioned, and then, of course, for everyone later on in the agenda, we also have a Q&A session scheduled as well. But for now, can you advise on how the prevailing wage requirements apply to tribal sovereign communities?
Well, it's somewhat complex, but they don't. The general, I mean, I wouldn't you know, but work performed on tribal land and administered by tribal sovereign communities, it's my understanding is exempted from coverage and prevailing wage law. But you know, there's some, as with everything, there's some nuance to that response, and it's important to know exactly. Reach out to me specifically or email that general email address, and I can try and help you figure out if you have a specific question. But generally speaking, tribal sovereign land and administered by tribal entities is exempted from the prevailing wage law. So,
great, thank you very much. And in regards to related work, can you expand a little bit about that term? Does it have to be related to construction?
Well, it depends. And I think those two decisions that I was just Busker and Fonseca, Mendoza Fonseca are they related to. I don't know in what part of the presentation you're referring to, but that's a pretty open-ended question. I need some more specificity. It's hard for me to know what the question refers to exactly, and I don't want to say anything in a large public presentation which could be misconstrued as but you know, if you have a question like that, I would suggest sending an email to that email address, and we can try and help you clarify.
Okay, perfect. Thank you again so much, Isaac, for your time. We're now going to jump on to our next presentation by Lance and David from the Labor Commissioner's Office. They're going to be covering hot topics.
Good morning. Should be off mute now. My name is Lance Grusella. I'm an attorney with the Labor Commissioner's Office in our San Diego office. Excuse me. I'm going to start kicking us off here with our legal updates and public works hot topics, and my colleague David Cross is going to jump in a little while. We're going to be speaking primarily about skilled and trained workforce. So with that, let's get started. And we're ahead of the clock here, so have some time for questions at the end. I would encourage everyone just to save your questions about skilled and trained. If you haven't typed them and sent them already, you know, I think there's a lot to go through, and totally fine to ask them later, but you know, I'm hoping that we answer many of them through the presentation, because we've done this quite a bit. So hopefully we can pepper in some of those answers. So I think we might have skipped a disclaimer. I'm not going to read it to you. It's in the materials. We don't. Thank you. But basically, just to let you know that this presentation, as Isaac explained, is not legal advice, and any opinions are our own, not official opinions of the division or the department. So with that, we'll get into the skilled and trained workforce. And so I think present this each time, and I think it's very important because especially of how confusing this web of statutes can be, it's important to understand how we got to where we are today, because everyone sort of has a different role, whether you're a contractor or awarding body, the Labor Commissioner's Office. And so basically before 2016, there's this patchwork of laws that started popping up in different places, and I mean different places because there's now, I think, 21 or 22, if not more at this point, of this patchwork, these statutes that started requiring that certain projects, typically when they were being done under an alternative procurement method. There's a lot of different synonyms for this, but I'm assuming many of you might be nodding your heads to understand what that means. But basically, when these projects were being public works projects that are being bid out in using alternative contracting methods, for example, like lease-back, that's a big one. So anyway, so what was happening is there was this statement that basically said contractors need to use a skilled and trained workforce, but there was a requirement to have an enforceable commitment. But before that, there wasn't even a definition of what a skilled and trained workforce meant. And so I remember we would get questions, and this wasn't even really, it wasn't not on our radar, but we had nothing to do with it. You'll see how we got involved more recently. But basically, in 2016, since this patchwork in, for example, the education code, the government code, and education code, if I didn't say that already. Anyway, there is a chart that there's a link, slide with 2 links later on. It's in the material, so you can actually click on it. But there is a chart that is, does our best to kind of pull those together so that you can refer to it. There's also a link to the FAQs, which I really encourage everyone to look at. They're extensive, and they do go into detail and provide examples. So if you have a question that you feel wasn't answered, please do check out the FAQs. They are detailed. So in 2016, what happened was SB 693 was passed. And so you had all these statutes everywhere that said use a skilled and trained workforce. And everyone said, well, what does that even mean? So finally, we got a definition. And it created Public Contracts Code section 2600 through 2602. There are now more sections there that apply, but this was the beginning of that, where basically those sections were created to say, okay, if you have a project where skilled and trained workforce is required, here are the rules. And so it sort of centralized everything. It didn't clean up the fact that these appear in all these, this patchwork. That's still the case, unfortunately, and that's just how it is. But what it did was it now says if you're being pointed there, meaning by the virtue of the fact that the project requires a skilled and trained workforce, then it lays out the rules of requirement. And so it also, importantly, includes a section that allows an awarding body to use a skilled and trained workforce for any public works project, even if it's not required. So I always pause to point that out because, there's often questions about like whether or not it's necessary for certain projects. And just so you understand from the Labor Commissioner's Office, our perspective, we're not super concerned with that, because once the awarding body decides that they're going to require it, it doesn't matter whether or not it was in a particular statute. They're permitted to do that on any public works project. So that's not to say that it's required for all public works projects. That's certainly not the case. But it is true that if it's already there, it's in the contract, it's in the bid materials, then you can be sure that these are requirements that you'd have to follow if you're going to be bidding or working on this project. And as you'll see, there's a pretty high bar, and there's some concern out there. And what we've kind of seen through feedback is, as a contractor, you need to be very aware of what these requirements are, because it's not something you want to try to deal with after you've already agreed to be involved in the project. Because if you don't, as David's going to explain, there's consequences to that. So, we're going to go through this, and we're kind of focused on what the law is as of the beginning of this year. So just keep that in mind. It is important to understand how we got here, though, and you'll see that, I think. So with that, next slide, please. We had more recent changes, and this was effective January 1st of this year. We had AB 2311, and that amended Public Contracts Code section 2600. And that basically said to the awarding body, you must put this in the bid advertisement notice, the language notifying contractors that skilled and trained workforce requirements do apply. But at the same time, it also clarified that if the AB doesn't do that, that doesn't mean that the obligation to use a skilled and trained workforce doesn't apply. So if you're a contractor and the issue comes up, you need to be on your toes to make sure that if this is a project where that's required, again, you're ready to meet those requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so naturally this brings us to the question, which is, what is a skilled and trained workforce? So I would propose to you all that this slide right here is, in a nutshell, the entire definition, okay? It's simple, but also complex. And if this is the first time that you're, kind of learning about this, being exposed to this, then you're scratching your head, then you are not alone. It definitely takes a while to sink in. I think just listen and go back to the materials. And again, then once you look at the materials, which I think is a good condensed version, it'll be very helpful to go to those FAQs. So this is a resource. This is basically an outline, because this is sort of like a flow chart, which you're going to see another version of this in a minute. But basically, when a contractor is required to complete a project using a skilled and trained workforce, what that means is that all of the following conditions need to be met. So all of the workers that contractor and all of the subcontractors are employing are to perform work in an apprenticeable occupation. So that's a key first here. If there's an occupation that isn't apprenticeable, and most of them are, but there are some that are not, then this, none of this is going to apply. But for all apprenticeable occupations, when work is performed, then every worker has to be either a skilled journey person or a registered apprentice, a DAS registered apprentice. At its core, that is the rule. So let that sink in, because that's, as we're going to see, we need to go and look at what a skilled journey person is. But, that there is no exception to that general rule, right? So everyone needs to be either a registered apprentice, that's easy, or a skilled journey person. We'll zoom in on each of these in detail and as we go through it, but just keep that in mind. On top of that, there's this graduation percentage requirement, and this is what most folks seem to be struggling with, and it's, it's a little nuanced, but the bottom line is that between 30 and 60% of all of the skilled journey persons in the apprenticeable crafts that are employed on the project have to be graduates of an apprenticeship program. I'm going to say that again, because this is actually what it says. Some people can't believe it. This is the rule. 30 to 60%, depending on the trade, and we'll get into that in a few minutes, of all of the skilled journey persons. So if they're not an apprentice, okay, they are a skilled journey person. On top of that, 30 to 60% of all of those skilled journey persons have to have graduated from an apprenticeship program. Now the percentage depends on the craft, and we're going to get into that. And just keep in mind that you can meet the requirement by counting either head count, like the number of people, or the number of hours. Now there are minor exceptions to the graduation percentage requirement. But if you have an apprenticeable craft and there's a skilled and trained workforce requirement, then it's the only exceptions that may apply would be to the graduation percentage requirement. Keep that in mind. Everyone still has to be a skilled journey person or an apprentice that's employed. And those exceptions are where there's less than 10 hours of work being performed in a particular trade, and if their subcontractor is performing less than 1/2 of 1% of the total contract and wasn't listed in the bid. Okay, next slide, please. So this is basically the last slide in a visual format. So I'm a visual learner. Some of my colleagues, we kind of mash this together. This is kind of saying the same thing we just looked at, and this is intended for you to go back and look at afterwards. Again, if this all seems like it's just in another language, then that's okay. Again, if this is the first time, especially if this is the first time you're, listening to this presentation on this topic, but that's why this is here, to go back and hopefully kind of untangle some of this. And again, I really encourage you with these kind of resources to go to the FAQs, because so many of the kind of questions that follow are addressed in there. Next slide. Okay, who is a skilled journey person, right? So again, the basic rule is everyone that if you're a contractor or a subcontractor and there's a skilled and trained workforce requirement, well, everyone you employ in an apprenticeable craft has to be either an apprentice or a skilled journey person. Apprentice, it's easy. And I will mention this, what I mean by easy is black and white, right? It is, they're either apprentice or they're not. You can go on the DIS website, you can type in their workers' information, and it will pop up a certification and let you know whether or not that person is a registered apprentice and in what craft. Okay, that's fine. Everyone else that isn't meeting, that criteria has to be a skilled journey person. Well, what does that mean? Okay, there's two ways to qualify as a skilled journey person, basically. It is either that a worker has graduated from a DIS-approved apprenticeship program for that trade. Okay, so just to kind of clarify that, if you have someone working as an electrician on a project and they were a labor apprentice and they graduated from a labor apprenticeship program, that is not going to qualify them as a skilled journey person, a skilled journey electrician, right? And to be a graduate, they can have graduated, if they were out of state, basically, it has to be a Department of Labor or federally approved apprenticeship program. So that is the graduate portion, okay? If they're not a graduate, they can qualify as a skilled journey person by having at least as many hours of on-the-job experience in that occupation as would be required to graduate from a DIS-approved apprenticeship program. So for example, if you're employing electricians, and I'm making this up, but let's say in San Diego County, it is, 10,000 hours of training in order to graduate from an electrical apprenticeship program. Then if I had more than 10,000 hours of experience, of on-the-job experience at working as an electrician, I would be qualified as a skilled journey person. But again, remember, that's different. I'm not a graduate, and that's on top. The graduation percentage requirement is on top of this definition, which I'm getting ahead of myself, but the point is, just keep in mind that you're limited in the number of workers that qualify as in order to meet the skilled and trained workforce requirements. You're limited in the number of workers that are qualified as a skilled journey person by their on-the-job experience because of the graduation percentage requirement, and we're going to get into that. So next slide. Okay, this chart looks sort of daunting. One day we'll probably just forget about it and list the things in the middle. I think it provides context for the time being to understand why the rules don't really make sense right now. Okay, to many, I should say. So basically, what this is showing is when this first started, and you'll notice it basically was in 2016, right, when we had that legislation that sort of created a cohesive system, let's call it, of rules. Then there was this, it said for the future, we're going to have a phase-in requirement. And what it did was it said, okay, all the graduation percentage requirement for all trades is going to be 30% starting next year, which was January 1st, 2017. Then it was going to go up 10% every year till it hit 60. Okay, that happened and that remained. But in the meantime, the newer statutes were, some of the trades obviously spoke with their legislators, and the legislature went back and they revised this phase-in. And what it did was, the more recent legislation exempted Teamster altogether from the graduation percentage requirement. So again, none of these exceptions or exemptions, whatever you want to call them, are from the skilled and trained workforce requirement itself. It's that the graduation percentage requirement doesn't apply, which is kind of this extra layer on top of everything. So what does that mean? That means that if you're employing just Teamsters, you still need to have everyone that you employ needs to be a skilled journey person or an apprentice. But you don't have to have a minimum number of employees or hours that are graduates of an apprenticeship program. Okay. As of January 1st, 2017, every craft except Teamster was at 30%. Then part of this new legislation said, what they did was they capped certain trades at that 30%, where they were supposed to phase into the 60%. And that's what you're seeing in the middle here, okay? So what this is showing is that, and also I would point out, this is dependent upon the dates of work. And so the reason I mentioned that this chart would be, sort of obsolete one day, it really technically is. But again, I think it adds important context to really kind of understand this. But it's the date that work is being performed. So unlike some of the other things you're going to hear my colleagues talk about later about public works requirements where the bid add date applies and it's kind of things are frozen in time for good reason. This is straight up just based on when the work is done. So as we sit here today, we're almost at the end of 2021. We are way past January 1st, 2020. So it's 60% for all of the trades except the ones that are listed in the middle. Because what happened is after January 1st, 2017, they were all at 30% except Teamster. And then January 1st, 2018, it ratcheted up to 40% except Teamster, still there's no graduation percentage requirement. And all of these crafts listed here were frozen at 30%. Okay, so I usually use like electrician and carpenter as the two examples because they're pretty, ubiquitous and they illustrate here. So for example, if it's January, it's June of 2017, and I'm employing carpenters and electricians, right? There is a 30% or more of the skilled journey persons that I employ have to be graduates of an apprenticeship program in order for me to meet the skilled and trained workforce requirements. As time went on, so today, right? That percentage requirement went up each year for electricians, but because, carpenters listed here, it remained at 30%. And so today, 2021, if the same thing were true and I'm performing work as a contractor, subcontractor on a skilled and project where skilled and trained workforce requirements apply, the electricians, 60% or more of the electricians that I employ have to be graduates of an apprenticeship program. 30% or more of the carpenters that I employ have to be graduates of an apprenticeship program. And just to kind of drive the point home, if I'm also employing Teamsters, then they have to be skilled journey persons. Remember, they have to have that on-the-job training, the experience, or be registered apprentices. But there is no graduation percentage requirement. And I think I failed to mention this so far, but I will point out this requirement, so everyone being either an apprentice or a skilled journey person, this is totally separate from the apprenticeship requirements under Labor Code Section 1777.5, which you're going to hear about later, and that's the DAS forms requesting apprentices. Those are separate requirements, okay? So here, it's not saying you do have to comply with those. On top of that, what this is saying is that one way to qualify, your workforce qualifies as being skilled and trained is if someone is a registered apprentice. They're automatically counted as skilled and trained. The others all must be skilled journey persons. So I just want to clarify that. It is confusing, and I understand that. And hopefully, if anyone has questions on that, to kind of keep those lines distinct, we can address that. So this chart, again, it's just to kind of illustrate how we got here. But basically, today, if you're working on a project that skilled and trained workforce requirements apply to, if the craft is on this list, Teamster, there's no graduation requirements. All the other ones on this list are at 30%. And if they're not listed, it's 60. Okay. Thank you. Sorry for repeating myself, but I think it's necessary with some of this stuff. Next slide, please. Okay, this is like a limited exception. It doesn't specify an actual trade. You're going to have to be familiar with your trade and to know whether this is true. Only one classification has been brought to my attention so far, but you'd have to check with DAS. Let me get out ahead of this question. We don't have all this information. We enforce the law. David's going to get into that and sort of how, we kind of recently got involved. But if you have a question and you think that this limited exception might apply, you'd have to contact DAS to see where basically, if there was no approved apprenticeship program before January 1st, 1995 for a particular trade, then it basically cuts the graduation percentage requirement in half by allowing a contractor to satisfy 1/2 of the graduation percentage requirement by skilled journeyman persons who have the on-the-job training. But there's this hitch here. They have to have started working before the apprenticeship program began. So, you know, if you're seeking this out, just be careful, because in addition to this circumstances having to be met that there wasn't this apprenticeship program, you know, if you have someone who started working as an electrician 2 years ago, and, you know, and you're trying to claim that, well, there wasn't an apprenticeship program in here, you know, for electricians, which I don't think it applies to, but, you know, that wouldn't matter, because the person also has to be having worked before the apprenticeship programs were created. So again, it's very narrow. These are more common, and these are sort of important to understand and to consider, that the graduation percentage requirement can be satisfied in either way. And it's not necessary for a contractor or subcontractor to like declare how they're doing it. It's just that, you know, in hindsight, they have to have done, the math has to work out so that either counting the number of people that are employed on the project in a particular trade, or the hours in a particular trade will meet the graduation percentage requirement. And so basically, you know, you could have, and again, the FAQs are great for this because they give examples with numbers. And so, you know, I sit here and pull numbers out of thin air. And so I know that's kind of confusing. So I hesitate to do that. But so for solid examples, and again, sorry for repeating myself, but the FAQs are a great resource. But you can count the number of people who are graduates, and you can say, you know, we had 2 people working on this project as electricians. One of them is a skilled a graduate, the other is not. Now, that actually would be not, that would be an example of not complying, because that would be only 50%. So there's a good example to keep in mind where you could get tripped up. If you only had 2 workers, you know, and you were trying to rely on counting the workers, that would not cut it. Now, if you had 2 workers and one of them was a graduate and the other was not, you would need to make sure that the graduate performed at least 60% of the hours on that project for each calendar month. That would be a way to have 2 workers, because again, you can use either way. You're not, you know, it's just that you have, by the end of the month, you can look back and qualify either way. Next slide, please. So there are other exceptions that, again, these are more common, and but keep in mind that these are exceptions only to the graduation percentage requirement, not generally to the skilled and trained workforce requirement. And that is where in a particular trade, and remember, we're always talking about calendar months with the skilled and trained workforce requirement. So in a particular calendar month, if there's less than 10 hours of work for a particular an apprenticeable craft, then the graduation percentage requirement doesn't apply. So again, we'll use the example with electricians. You know, if you're out there and you perform 8 hours, you have your workforce perform 8 hours of work for electricians in a month, then there's not going to be any requirement that the person or persons who perform the total 8 hours of work. That's for all, that would be for all electrician work for the month, right? Now, once it goes over that, you know, that's not going to apply. So you need to make sure, you know, if you're going to be relying on that, you have to be pretty sure that you're not going to run afoul of that limit. The other way is if the subcontractor is not listed on the bid pursuant to Public Contracts Code 4104, and they're not performing work that exceeds 1/2 of the total general contract. So both of those have to be true, right? So if you start off the project and they're both true, and it changes, meaning like, let's say you're a subcontractor, you're not listed on the bid, you are 1/2 of, you know, it's a tiny fraction of the work, but then, you know, as you're working, there's some sort of change order or change to the scope, and you end up getting something where it brings you to be over 1/2 of 1%, then that's no longer going to apply. and you're going to have to meet the graduation percentage requirement. So please keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So whenever a contractor is subject to these skilled and trained workforce requirements, again, from either the patchwork of statutes that says to the awarding body, if you're going to use this procurement method or you're going to have this type of project, you have to make contractors must agree to use a skilled and trained workforce, or on their own volition. Again, this catch-all where it says, you know, in addition, the contract or the awarding body, excuse me, can decide to require it, even if it's not required by statute. So if either of those are true, then the contractor has to make an enforceable commitment to perform the project or to execute the contract with using a skilled and trained workforce. And that's going to be obviously in the contract, right? And that's the enforceable agreement. And they also have to that also has to specify that the contractor and subcontractors at every tier have to comply. So this is, you know, from the top down, and that contractors are going to provide a report demonstrating compliance with the skilled and trained workforce requirements to the awarding body on a monthly basis throughout the project. And that's kind of key. And that's where, you know, David's going to get into some more of this, where basically the subcontractors are going to be reporting to the contractor to let them know how they're meeting the skilled and trained workforce requirements. And the contractor is going to be putting together a report that then goes to the awarding body on a monthly basis and demonstrates compliance. And I'm emphasizing that because keep in mind here, this is not a passive document like the CPRs. We're very used to the CPRs, for example, certified payroll record. Well, those are certainly important, and I'm not diminishing their importance, but they're basically just summaries of payroll documents, right? I have all these payroll documents, I'm summarizing them here. This report has to demonstrate, so it's not just, you know, a list of workers. It has to demonstrate how those workers meet the criteria meet the definition of a skilled and trained workforce. So do they qualify as skilled journey persons, or are they registered apprentices? If they're skilled journey persons, are they graduates, and so forth. And there's important responsibilities for the awarding body. I think David's going to get into that in a few moments. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to hand it over to David. He's going to get into some of the details here, and then we'll take some questions at the end.
I think we have this is David Cross. I'm a labor commissioner attorney in the Sacramento office. Don't we have a polling question here, Lance?
Yes, thank you. That's true. Okay, so the first question here is, to comply with the skilled and trained workforce requirements, at a minimum, a contractor must ensure all workers are either DAS registered apprentices or have at least as many hours of on-the-job experience in the occupation as would be required to graduate from a DAS approved program. True or false? So take a minute and answer that question, and then we'll go over that. Okay. All right. Well, this is basically what happens every time. And so the answer is actually false, but it's a trick question. So for those of you waving your fists in the air at me, I understand. But it's important because it really highlights, I think, the biggest potential stumbling block for contractors here, which is the reason it's a trick question, because it's not wrong, but it's not complete. The statement, which I know there's enough words there for everyone, but it's missing the graduation percentage requirement, right? So it starts off to say, to comply with the skilled and trained workforce requirement at a minimum. And this is false. And the reason is because not only does a contractor have to ensure that everyone is either a DAS registered apprentice or has at least as many hours of on-the-job experience, but depending on the classification, so again, unless it's Teamster, there's some minimum graduation percentage requirement, and that isn't there. So again, no one's really wrong there. I know it's kind of a trick, but it's really to illustrate how important that is, because just keep in mind that if you did just that, you're not going to meet that graduation percentage requirement and you're going to run into trouble. All right, and with that, thank you, David, for reminding me about that. Turn it over to you.
Great. So I'm David Cross. We're going to go through the public entity awarding bodies obligations, and we're going to cover what happens with the labor commissioner enforcement process at the end. I'm going to have a couple slides on pre-construction activities. The one takeaway, I think, and the summary of what Lance said that's the most important thing for contractors to realize is that you should not bid a skilled and trained workforce job unless you can meet the requirements. I've had lots of contractors attend these and say, I bid a job, I got the contract, and now I have to figure out how to comply. And the short answer is it's almost impossible. We'll go through the reasons why, but I think that you really need to be aware of how you are going to comply with these requirements before you bid the job. All right, so failure to provide or incomplete monthly report. If the contractor fails to provide the monthly report, well, that's pretty straightforward. You prime contractors, you're collecting all the reports from your subcontractors, and you're getting them all together in a package, and you're sending them once a month, every month, to the awarding body. And the awarding body knows, well, we don't have the reports. We are out on the job. We're monitoring the job. We have inspectors going out and looking at who's on the job. And we don't have the reports from all of these subcontractors. And so the prime contractor is not providing us monthly reports. That's easy. The more difficult situation is this part of the public contracts code that says if the contractor provides an incomplete report. What is an incomplete report? There is no bright line answer. A report that says, oh, we complied, we would consider that to be incomplete. A report from a subcontractor that says we had 10 workers in this craft on the project. These 6 were graduates of a approved program. Here's the dates they graduated. Some subcontractors even attach copies of their graduation certificates, although I wouldn't say that's required, but I am saying that that's how some people show this. We are developing a sample form. It has to get approved and also get put on our website. We're hoping that comes shortly, but until then, just make sure that in looking at the report, you awarding bodies can tell that there has been actual compliance. So contractor doesn't provide the report or provides an incomplete one, the public agency or awarding body shall withhold further payments until a complete report is provided. So I've had awarding bodies ask me, well, we don't really want to do this because for various reasons, but it's required, it shall. So the awarding body shall withhold further payments until a complete report is provided. And I'll tell you, awarding bodies, when you withhold the payments, that really lights a fire under the contractor to get you the reports. Much more effective than just pestering them. Now, if a monthly report is incomplete because a subcontractor didn't submit the required information, the awarding body withholds an amount only equal to 150% of the monthly billing for that sub, and the contractor can withhold the same amount from the sub. Now, at the bottom of this slide, I always say this is an indication of how seriously the legislature took the skilled and trained workforce requirements. The awarding body is required to immediately resume making payments to the contractor if the contractor substitutes a subcontractor for failing to provide the complete report. So there is no back and forth. There is no requirement for some interactive process. There is no requirement for notice. The contractor, the prime contractor, can just substitute a subcontractor. They can boot the non-compliant subcontractor off the job and bring in somebody who is going to comply. And this is very unusual in the Public Contracts Code. And I think it just shows how important it is to comply with these requirements. Yeah, the contractor can substitute a sub for its failure and replace it with one that provides an enforceable commitment to use skilled and trained workforce. Let's go to the next slide. So, monthly report failing to demonstrate compliance. This is kind of repetitious, but it expands upon what we just talked about. And if the monthly report doesn't demonstrate compliance, the awarding body is required to do all the following: withhold further payments until the contractor provides a plan to achieve substantial compliance. What does that mean? If the subcontractor has finished their work on the job, there is no way that this subcontractor is going to achieve substantial compliance. This is not a situation where you can say, oh, I'm going to make this up on the next job. So that is something to think about when you're, as the awarding body, looking at whether this is a plan to achieve substantial compliance. A plan to achieve substantial compliance, we have hired these individuals who are graduates. They are on the project, and in 2 months we will be in compliance. Well, that's different. That is a plan to achieve substantial compliance. The awarding body also has to withhold 150% of the monthly billing for the sub, and the awarding body has to immediately resume making payments if the contractor substitutes a sub. And the awarding body is required to immediately resume making payments if the contractor submits a plan to achieve substantial compliance, unless the awarding body rejects the plan as insufficient, explains the reasons for rejection within a reasonable time. One reason for rejection is your subcontractors finished their work on the project, so there cannot be any substantial compliance. And then the awarding body is supposed to forward a copy of the non-compliant monthly report. This is really important because we get some awarding bodies that send us every single monthly report, and that isn't anything that is required under the Public Contracts Code. Only send the non-compliant reports to the Labor Commissioner. And that's where the Labor Commissioner reviews the situation, reviews the documents to see whether a civil wage and penalty assessment will be issued for non-compliance with skilled and trained workforce requirements. And then finally, the awarding body is to forward a copy of the plan to achieve substantial compliance and its response to the Labor Commissioner. So let's go on to the next slide. So now we go into the Labor Commissioner's enforcement process. What happens when we get these non-compliant reports? Let's go on to the next slide. So for skilled and trained workforce violation, penalties up to $5,000 per month of work performed in violation of skilled and trained workforce requirements. That can go up to $10,000 per month for second or subsequent violation within a 3-year period. Now, again, these penalties are up to $5,000 per month. The Labor Commissioner uses discretion. What are the factors that the Labor Commissioner looks at? You'll see a lot of similarities here. These are very similar to the requirements in Labor Code Section 1775 for wage penalties and in Labor Code Section 1777.7 for apprentice penalties. Was the violation intentional? Whether the contractor or subcontractor committed other violations of this chapter or of the labor code. So not only violations of skilled and trained workforce requirements are taken into account, but any violation of the labor code. So we go back and look at the contractor's history, and if they have a failure, they've been issued a civil wage and penalty assessment in the past for not having apprentices on the project and for not responding to requests for certified payroll records, for not paying prevailing wage. That is a prior violation which is taken into consideration. So another factor, number 3, whether the contractor took steps to voluntarily remedy the violation. the extent or severity of the violation, and whether the contractor or subcontractor submitted and followed a plan to achieve substantial compliance. So these are all factors taken into account. If it's a very minimal violation, the penalty is going to be on the low side. And if it's a repeated violation by a repeat offender, then the penalties are going to be on the high side. So let's go on to the next slide. Now, prime contractors are jointly and severally liable for all of these penalties under the labor code for violations by their subcontractor. Now, there are some exceptions, and these are similar to the safe harbor provisions that we've seen in other labor code provisions. Prime contractors aren't liable for penalties of their sub unless the prime contractor had knowledge of the subcontractor's failure to comply. Well, if they didn't collect any reports, if the subcontractor didn't submit reports every month, the prime contractor had knowledge of the subcontractor's failure to comply. So that wouldn't get him out of these penalties. Or fails to comply with any of the following requirements. So for these contracts entered into on or after January 1st, 2019, the contract between the prime and the sub includes a copy of this provision and says, you have to comply, subcontractor, with skilled and trained workforce requirements. That's why it's really important to go and look at your subcontractor, at the subcontracts, and make sure that you update them, because it has to specifically say, you subcontractor will comply with skilled and trained workforce requirements. Contractor periodically monitors subcontractors' use of skilled and trained workforce. That means they went out and actually looked at whether or not the reports have been submitted. Upon becoming aware of failure, contractor took corrective action, including retention. And then this final one, which almost no prime contractors comply with, before making the final payment, the contractor obtains a declaration signed under penalty of perjury from the sub that the subcontractor complied with skilled and trained workforce requirements. This is a completely separate declaration. This is not just saying, oh, they submitted certified payroll records. This is not saying, oh, they submitted a declaration saying they complied with the requirement to pay prevailing wages. This is a separate declaration that you prime contractors have to have. If you don't have it, then you prime contractors are jointly and severally liable for the skilled and trained workforce penalties. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So, violations of the skilled and trained workforce requirements enforced by the Labor Commissioner using the same process which we currently use, which is issuance of a civil wage and penalty assessment. So after the deputy reviews all of the documents, does the investigation, make sure there's an actual violation, there is a civil wage and penalty assessment that's issued. And I would say to awarding bodies and to contractors who receive these, because they're served on the awarding body, they're served on the prime, they're served on the sub, they're served on the bonding company. Make sure you read it. There is a reason why these civil wage and penalty assessments are sent to the awarding bodies. First of all, to notify them of the claim, but secondly, to notify the awarding body of the withholding requirements under Labor Code section 1727A. And it says right in the civil wage and penalty assessment how much money the awarding body is required to withhold if they still are retaining funds. They have to hold those funds until the process is completed. And I'm going to talk about what that means in a minute, but you can't release it just because the contractor says, oh, we've resolved everything, give us our money. You have to be notified by the director that the process is done, or you have to be notified by the Labor Commissioner there's been a settlement. So awarding bodies, you have to hold on to the retention funds. Contractors, I think that the most important takeaway message is it lists a prime contractor and it lists a subcontractor on the civil wage and penalty assessment. And a lot of prime contractors say, well, this is for the violation by the sub, so I'm not going to pay any attention to it. And I would submit to you that's wrong. A prime contractor needs to file their own request for review. Now, Isaac was talking about the director's office, and the director's office serves as hearing officers in these matters. And there's a administrative process, and the hearing officers hold a hearing, and you get to put on witnesses, and you get to present evidence, and then the director's office issues a decision, either affirming, modifying, or dismissing the civil wage and penalty assessment. But you don't get in the door to that process unless you prime contractors and subcontractors file your own request for review. So I like to tell the prime contractors who have been told by the sub, don't worry, I will take care of this. Now, this is the same subcontractor that didn't follow the rules. This is the same contractor that screwed up on the reporting requirements on skilled and trained workforce, and you're going to count on them to represent you and defend your liability, because remember, you're jointly and severally liable. No, file your own request for review. This process can go on for years. During that time, the subcontractor could go out of business or file bankruptcy. Bankruptcy does not stay these administrative proceedings, which still will go forward and result in a judgment against you, prime contractor, if you don't file your own request for review. So enough preaching on that. You do get a chance to challenge this, and most of these cases settle. There is a discussion between the contractors and the deputies and myself if I'm handling the case, and we try and resolve these. Some of the cases do go to hearing, and then there's a decision. And then if there is a decision that upholds the civil wage and penalty assessment, the contractor can file a writ in the Superior Court challenging it. Now, the next part of the enforcement process is up to 3 years of debarment. This is going to be really unusual. Nobody here has to worry about that, because you all are getting education and you're going to follow the skilled and trained workforce rules. This is going to apply to people who are clueless and don't pay any attention to the rules. Up to 3 years of debarment when the labor commissioner finds a contractor or subcontractor to have violated skilled and trained workforce requirements, A, with the intent to defraud, or completely separately committed 2 or more separate willful violations of the skilled and trained workforce requirements within a 3-year period. We don't anticipate there's going to be a lot of these, because particularly for anybody who's come here and is actually making an effort to comply with the rules. So let's go on. I guess we got a few more minutes here. Let's go on and finish up the last couple of slides on pre-construction activities, and then there'll be time for questions, which you're going to put in the Q&A, and then they'll get read out. So let's go on to the next slide.
David, I think there's a poll question that's supposed to go up now.
Oh, yes, you're right. Thank
Okay,
you for
we're gonna
reminding me.
display it. No problem.
If a contractor employs one worker in apprenticeship classification for 20 hours during a calendar month, the worker does not have to be a graduate of an apprenticeship program. So either true or false. So go ahead and fill in the answers to that, and then we'll get some results up here in a minute. False. Excellent. This is great. You guys were listening. It's 10 hours. So I'm excited that you were able to answer this question correctly. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. We're almost at the end here of the presentation. Just got a couple more slides. So we get a lot of questions on pre-construction activities, and this has been the law for 20 years, because Labor Code Section 1720 was amended in 2001 to specify that construction includes work performed during design and pre-construction phases, including but not limited to inspection, land surveying. And then in 2014, so we're 7 years ago, further amended at post-construction work, the definition of construction. But despite these amendments, confusion persisted among the contracting community. So in order to address this confusion, statute was amended again to clarify that site assessments and feasibility studies are considered pre-construction work under the definition of construction for purposes of public works law. And statute was also amended to clarify that pre-construction activities subject to public works, regardless of whether any further construction work was conducted. So let's go on to the last slide. So January 1st, 2020, Labor Code Section 1720 is amended to expand the definition of public work to include work performed during construction site assessments, feasibility studies, specify that pre-construction work, including design, site assessments, et cetera, is part of a public work, regardless of whether any further construction work is conducted. Now, Isaac talked in the first presentation about the director and their coverage determination, and there actually was a coverage determination of this issue up in Alturas. It involved some work that was done, a feasibility study on a parking structure that was never built. And the contractor was actually an engineering firm, said, well, it was never built. We just did design work. And the director said, well, it doesn't really matter. It was design work, it was a site assessment, it was a feasibility study, it was an inspection. You were on the site, you did some work. Even though the project wasn't finished or wasn't ever constructed, prevailing wages were still required. So that's the state of the law where we are now. And we still have, it looks like 6 minutes for questions. So let's go to that. And I can't get into the Q&A, so I don't think.
I'm
yes, I can.
gonna have Joe read out some of the questions that
Okay,
haven't been
great.
answered yet.
Yeah, thanks, Daniela. We do have a couple of questions here. First up, so there are certain areas where skilled and trained workforce are scarce, mostly rural areas. Is there any relief for small districts?
Well,
So the answer to that, oh, go ahead.
no, I would say the answer's no, but there's a couple of things that you can look at. Go ahead, Lance.
No, I agree with that. The law doesn't provide any sort of exception for depending on where you are really, or the scarcity of, what the workforce is. That's why we're emphasizing the importance of understanding these requirements before, as a contractor, you get involved, whether it's bidding on or being included as a sub in a bid or working on one of these projects, because once you're in that situation, it might, we're getting feedback that depending on the trade and the location, sometimes it is very difficult, and these are high bars to meet. So
one thing you can do if you're a contractor in one of these areas is that you can contact an apprenticeship program and see if they have an expedited or accelerated program. And there's some programs that will actually enroll your workers and will allow them to participate. A lot of it's done remotely, so they don't actually have to travel to do this. And I haven't heard of one yet that completes this expedited program in less than 6 months. So it's not something that's instantaneous, but you can enroll people in these expedited programs and get them to be considered graduates of an apprenticeship program. And that's one way to deal with the situation.
Great, thank you, Lance and David. Next up, question for San Diego. There are no apprentice committees for roofers. Does this exempt them from the skilled and trained workforce requirements?
I was looking that up. It's an apprenticeable trade. I understand, the question and why that might be sort of the case, but again, this is where these requirements are statutory. So there's not the requirements apply to all apprenticeable occupations. So, for example, I just looked up the most recent determination for San Diego, and roofer is apprenticeable. You know, so that's an issue to bring up to DAS. You know, it sounds like the person's saying, well, it shouldn't be an apprenticeable occupation in San Diego County. I don't know. But my point is that there's no flexibility here. So that means that even though there's no program, you're still going to have to find graduates in order to meet the skilled and trained workforce requirements.
Great, thank you, Lance.
Just to kind of echo what David said, it seems like there's programs that are helping to address this issue by taking skilled journey persons that have a ton of experience and sort of going through a accelerated course to get them to be qualified as graduates. And so I would certainly look into that if I was, you know, in a situation where it seems like it would be impossible to otherwise, you know, get graduates. But you want to do this, again, I can't stress this enough. You want to do this before you're involved in this project, right? Because then we get questions like we have a couple today where it's like, well, this was impossible, so do I have to do it? And, you know, again, there's no flexibility with this. So the fact that you couldn't meet this, and even if you can prove that you couldn't meet it, right, that's not going to change the fact that you were required to do it. I know it sounds callous, but it's just, I mean, that's the way the law is written.
Thanks, Lance. I think we have time for one more here. Regarding the 60/40 journeyman apprentice requirement, how do we meet this if we have only 2 employees?
They've got to all be graduates.
Right. So I was explaining earlier, again, I tried not to do too much math just speaking, because it's like, go to the FAQs, but I would just use the example again. If you have 2 people, you know, you can use either a head count or hours. So if you have 2 people, was that the question? There's 2 people?
Correct.
Right. So if it's, and I don't remember, if the trade is at 60%, you're not going to meet it by counting the people unless they're both graduates. So if they're not both graduates, you need to make sure every calendar month that the one who is a graduate is performing 60% or more of the work. That's, you know, it's that granular. That's what's going on here. There was one quick, I just wanted to, I know we're sort of out of time. I wanted to answer it live. It was about my hypothetical, I think, with laborers and electrical work. And it kind of was sort of, and there's a couple other questions that are probably from the same person and related. Basically, the question is like, well, what if the, you know, apprenticeship program for laborers includes some of this type of work, or vice versa, whatever? And so the answer is, these are based on the classifications that you're employing and the determinations on the project under, you know, the prevailing wage determination. So it's by occupation. So that you're not going to be able to say, oh, well, this trade also overlap. It's like if you're employing electricians, then the person, in order to be a graduate for the purposes of skilled and trained workforce, they have to have graduated from an electrician apprentice program. If you're employing laborers and you want to have someone meet the graduation percentage requirement, they have to have graduated from a laborer apprenticeship program.
And just real quick, we've had a couple questions about contact information or who do we contact. Let me just give my email address. So this is David Cross again, dcross@ D as in dog, ir.ca.gov. And you can email me with your specific question. I'll see if I can help you. And then we'll try and answer some of these other questions in the chat, but I think we've got to go to break now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lance and David. We're now going to go ahead and take a 15-minute break, and we'll resume with our next presentation around 11:05. We're going to display a timer on the screen so you guys know when to return to your devices. All right, welcome back, everyone. Moving on with our webinar, we're going to go ahead and get started with our next presentation. We have Eric from the Labor Commissioner's Office speaking on contractor responsibilities.
Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Eric. I'm Secretary of the Labor Commissioner's Office Support Team. Can we move on to the next slide? So what policies are usually when you're contracting the investigation?
I'm sorry. Eric, your audio's pretty messed up. We can't really hear you that well.
Oh, really? Hear me now? Am I coming through now?
Oh yeah, much better.
Okay. Sorry about that. So, what policies are usually when you're basically contracting?
Sorry, Eric, it's bad again. No, still bad.
What exactly is the issue? Am I coming out or am I direct required?
Maybe you want to try calling in. I don't know if that'll make a difference. We can wait for you if you want to try.
Is there a right way to see if there's been an interpretation? I don't know how specific to me.
Sorry, guys, we're going to give Eric a minute to try to reconnect. If not, we'll go ahead and move on with our next presentation in about a minute or two. Thank you.
Okay, can you now? Am I coming through okay now?
Yeah, that sounds better.
Okay, this will be a little bit awkward for me. I'm not sure what's going on with my my laptop, but anyway, we can move on to the next slide. This is just a disclaimer. What I'm going to present is not legal advice, it's just guidance. So I'll be going over the obligations contractors must meet on public works projects, and we can move on to the next slide. And here we should have a quick polling question coming up. So which of the following is not a contractor's responsibility for a public works project? Assume the project does not meet any small project exemptions. So you have your 4 choices there. This should be pretty straightforward. Okay, yes. So B, registering the project under PWC 100 is the awarding agency responsibility, but we'll be going over registering as a public works contractor, submitting ECPRs, and paying prevailing wages. Okay, so on this slide, basically, we're going to cover the definition of a public works contractor. A public works contractor is anyone who bids on or enters into a contract to perform work that requires the payment of prevailing wages. This includes subcontractors who enter into a contract with another contractor to perform a portion of the work on a public works project, as well as sole proprietors and brokers who are responsible for performing work on a public works project, but do not use their employees or have their own employees to perform that work. Next slide, please. If you fit the definition of a public works contractor, you are required in order to bid on public works projects, to be listed on bid proposals, to be awarded a contract for public works project, and at all times when working on a public works project. So as a general convention, I often advise contractors that we expect you to be registered before you even think about public works. So your registration ideally should be active before you even decide to bid. Next slide, please. As covered earlier, a public works contractor must be registered with the DIR by the time bidding occurs. To bid on projects, to be listed on bid proposals, to be awarded a contract for, or working on a public works project, your registration must be active. Except for the small project exemptions that you see at the bottom, a total contract cost of $25,000 or less for construction, alteration, demolition, installation, or repair, or a total contract cost of $15,000 or less for projects concerning maintenance. Next slide, please. Here we have a visual that demonstrates our framework for a fiscal period in registration. Our fiscal periods begin July 1st of every year and end June 30th of the next year. In this visual, we see the current fiscal period beginning July 1st, 2021, ending June 30th, 2022. So I would draw your attention to the May 1st, 2022 date. That's basically early renewal. So you can come into our system and you can register early instead of having to wait closer to the expiration of the current fiscal period. So note that your registration must be active in order to bid on projects, to be listed on bid proposals, to be awarded a contract, or to be working on a public works project. Any activity in public works must occur within the time frame of the fiscal period or the fiscal periods that you applied for. Also note that if you're registering for the first time near the end of the fiscal period, your registration will expire at the end of that current fiscal period. And we should have a polling question coming up. A contractor registers for the first time on June 1st, 2021, and pays $400 for 1 year's registration. When will that registration expire? And you can use the slide that's directly in front of you. So there's a little bit of confusion here, and that's understandable. So the two dates, December 31, December 31, May 31, none of those dates are on the visual in front of you. So we're looking at the June 30th, 2021 due date. So if you're registering for the first time on June 1st, you have to expect that your registration will end June 30th, 2021, unless you applied for multiple fiscal periods. We can move on to the next slide. So registration is a rather simple obligation that can have severe consequences. You'll want to be mindful as a public works contractor that your registration is active when it's required. So if you've been on a public works project, you're listed on a bid proposal, you're awarded a contract, or you're working on a public works project without an active registration or on an expired registration, a registration violation will occur. Failing to register timely when it's required can result in penalties. We'll be covering that in the next slide. When it comes to possible penalties associated with our registration system, a penalty will be assessed for a registration violation. From July 1st to September 30th, it's possible to be assessed a mitigated penalty of $400 for a registration violation that is accidental. If a violation is not accidental, a $2,000 penalty will apply. Any violations that occur after September 30th will be assessed a $2,000 penalty regardless of whether or not the violation is accidental. Next slide, please. If your legal entity is performing work on a public works project near the end of the fiscal period, you want to be mindful of incurring a registration violation. For example, if your company is scheduled to perform work during all days between June 30th and July 1st, your registration must be renewed by July 1st, 2022. To avoid the possibility of incurring a registration violation, it's advisable to try to renew early on May 1st or apply for extra fiscal periods beforehand. And we have a polling question coming up. So if a contractor has a registration that expires on June 30th, 2021, and is scheduled to perform work on a public works project between June 28th and July 2nd, 2021, when does this contractor need to have the registration renewed by? And the follow-up question is, will a violation occur if the contractor is unable to renew by July 1st, 2021? So yes, basically, your registration, this contractor's registration needs to be active by July 1st, 2021, because that's the beginning of the next fiscal period. And will a violation occur if the contractor fails to renew by July 1st? Yes, so just be mindful that the May 1st due date is there, but if you anticipate work being performed around that time, you can also apply for multiple fiscal periods when you renew or you register for the first time. Next slide, please. An unregistered contractor can be liable for additional penalties as well. Under Labor Code 1771.1, subsection G, unregistered contractors engaged in the performance of work on a public works project can be assessed penalties of $100 for each day of work in violation, up to a max penalty of $8,000. Higher tier contractors are also liable for hiring unregistered contractors, and the penalties are calculated in pretty much the same way. $100 for each day an unregistered contractor is performing work in violation of the registration, not to exceed an aggregate penalty of $10,000. Registration penalties will be issued on the civil wage and penalty assessment. Next slide, please. Stop orders can be issued for other violations. So a stop order can be issued against an unregistered contractor. Stop orders that are issued can disrupt or delay all public works projects that the unregistered contractor is involved in until that unregistered contractor corrects their registration. In addition to that, stop orders can be issued for violations such as failure to maintain workers' compensation insurance. Next slide, please. When a stop order is issued, workers affected by a stop order are entitled up to 10 days of their wages. Failure to observe a stop order by an unregistered contractor is considered a misdemeanor. As such, it's punishable by imprisonment in a county jail not exceeding 60 days, or an additional fine not exceeding $10,000, or possibly even both. Just to reiterate what we discussed so far, registration is a simple obligation that can have severe consequences. As a public works contractor, you alone are responsible for ensuring that your registration is active and up to date when it's required. Please be advised that it is now possible for approved registrations to be revoked due to registration violations. Please review the new CCR sections 16.414 and 16.415 for more information. Next slide, please. So here we have a fact pattern, and it's going to follow up with a couple of questions. Here we have a total project cost of $500,000, award to a prime contractor. DEFCO was awarded a subcontract for ABC for a total of $50,000. An unregistered second tier subcontractor hired by DEFCO to install modular systems for $10,000. The Labor Commissioner's Office comes to perform an inspection at the project site and discovers that this second tier subcontractor is unregistered. ABC Genco and DEFCO are both registered. A stop order is issued against that second tier subcontractor. So with this fact pattern, we'll be needing that to answer the following questions. All work must stop. All work on the project must stop immediately. True or false? Will DEFCO be liable for Labor Code 1771.1 H penalties? Yes or no? Are all contractors here required to be registered with the DIR? Yes or no? Okay, so for the first question, all work on the project must stop immediately. If you look at the previous slide, basically the stop order pertains to that unregistered contractor, so the answer is false. Will DEFCO be liable for 1771.1 penalties? The answer is yes, because they are the ones that hired that unregistered contractor. And are all the contractors required to be registered with the DIR? The answer is yes, because basically this project at $500,000 total project costs does not fit within any of the small project exemptions that we discussed earlier. So we can move on to the next slide. Another core obligation that contractors must meet on public works projects is that all contractors on a public works project must pay the prevailing wage rate to all workers. And you see a threshold there, except for public works projects of $1,000 or less. Can move on to the next slide. So what we have here is a general discussion of the prevailing wage determination. So the director of the Department of Industrial Relations, they determine the general prevailing rate for wages. And basically these determinations are published twice a year, February 22nd, August 22nd, by the Office of Policy, Research, and Legislation. It takes 10 days for them to be effective. And after the issue dates of the determination, so we're talking about March 3rd for leap years, March 4th for non-leap years for anything published on February 22nd, and September 1st for anything published on August 22nd. So we can move on to the next slide. Here we're going to cover a brief demonstration on how to research a proper prevailing wage determination. So we look at this is Bakersfield, and this is also Kern County, and we have a bid advertisement date of 3/10/2019. So for February 22nd, so for February 22nd publication, we're looking at either 3/3 or 3/4 for that 10-day effective time period. So this is past that 10-day. So we're looking at 2019-1. That is the correct determination. Next slide, please. So here we have a little demonstration about how to research a prevailing wage determination. This is what it looks like on our website. So if you look at the top left there, this is 2019-1 general prevailing wage determination. And you follow each of the steps, essentially step 1, step 2, step 3, until you find the craft that you're looking for. And depending on where you end up, you can see how crafts are listed on our website. And we do have a quick polling question coming up. So how do you know if a predetermined increase for a specific wage determination, how do you know if there's one that's scheduled for a specific wage determination? Do you look for a double asterisk next to expiration date, single asterisk, or do you just check the next determination? Okay, so it's a bit divided. So when it comes to looking at your wage determination, if you want to see if there's a scheduled predetermined increase, you're going to look at the expiration date and you're going to look for that double asterisk. So if you see that double asterisk next to the expiration date of the determination that you're looking for, then that's basically saying that there's a scheduled predetermined increase coming up. And we'll be covering that in the next slide. So if you look at the two arrows, the one that's pointing to the right, that yellow arrow, it's pointing to the pound sign next to the labors and related classifications. That's basically indicating that this particular craft is subject to apprenticeship requirements when those apprenticeship thresholds are met. So once you see that pound sign, immediately know that this is an apprenticeable craft. But as for the previous question that we just asked, if you look at the yellow arrow pointing upwards, that is what the double asterisk looks like next to the expiration date of the determination. Right away, once you see that, you know that there are scheduled predetermined increases for this particular determination. And what they look like, you're basically looking to the left. Looking to the right. So the predetermined increases for labors and related classifications. So if you're following this along, just and it's advisable that when you're researching your wage determination, that you look at this piece by piece and you just make sure that you're following all the requirements. So it also shows the localities that this predetermined increase applies to: Imperial, Inyo, Kern. And it also has more specifications. And if you look towards the middle / bottom, you can see labor and you can see that predetermined increase. We have one that's scheduled effective July 1, 2019. And there's a distribution there for $2.05. And then another one for July 1, 2020, and another one for July 2021. And each one has a specific increase with a breakdown distribution. So this is what a predetermined increase looks like. And these are the symbols that signal, one, that this craft is apprenticeable, and two, that there's a predetermined increase that's scheduled coming up. We can move on to we do have a quick polling question coming up. So how can you tell if a craft is apprenticeable? So given what I've just explained, this should be a quick review. Do you contact the DAS to find out if a craft is apprenticeable? Do you search the pound sign next to the craft name? Or do you look at the double asterisk on the date of expiration? Okay, so basically, yes, you are looking for that pound sign next to the craft. It's not the double asterisk, because basically the double asterisk is for predetermined increases. So you're looking for that pound sign, and that'll tell you if this craft is apprenticeable. You can move on to the next slide. So this is a brief cover of overtime and holidays. So basically, overtime and holidays, these requirements can vary from craft to craft. You'll want to be mindful of the distributions, provisions, and footnotes on a determination. In general, most anything over 8 hours on weekdays is considered overtime. Saturday and Sunday holiday rate is listed accordingly. Next slide, please. Oh, we just skipped over a slide. So basically what you're looking at here is how in general our website looks and what kind of information that you can find for a particular craft. So for this example, we're looking at carpenters. So basically if you click on that link for carpenters, it's going to load up the actual determination. But that drop-down menu you see there, it's going to show holidays, holiday provisions, scope of work provisions, and travel and subsistence provisions. And you can also see for some crafts, there's an actual predetermined increase, and there's an increase link next to the carpenter. So in general, when you're researching your wage determination, it's advisable to not only review the determination in detail, but to print out and review the holiday provisions, scope of work provisions, travel, as well as the increases, just to make sure that you're fully aware of the requirements and you're following them as best you can. And we do have a quick polling question coming up. So what wage determination would apply if the first bid add date was today? So basically today is 11/17/2021. So what determination would you be researching if a bid came out today? So yes, a lot of you picked 2021-2. So once again, we're looking at for February 22nd, March 3rd, and March 4th. That's the 10-day effective date. But what pertains to us is the August 22nd publication date. So that's 9/1. So basically we're well past September 1st. So we're currently in the 2021-2 determination. You can move on to the next slide. So this next slide basically covers an example breakdown of wage determination. In particular, we're looking at Group 3 laborers. We see the basic wage of 35.34, and then the employer payments, health and welfare, pension, vacation holiday, training, and other. So basic wage, that's basically the minimum that's going directly to the worker. The employer payments, barring training funds, can be paid either to the worker or to a third party. So we're talking about health and welfare, pension, vacation holiday, and other. Training funds, since this is an apprenticeable craft, it's going to go directly to a third party, which is the CAC or an approved apprenticeship program. If the craft is not apprenticeable, then training fund actually goes directly to the workers. So that's something to remember. When it comes to the actual distributions, we have a couple of examples at the bottom. So the first distribution that we see here, this contract is paying 35.34 directly to the worker. And as for fringe benefits, they're paying it all into pension, which is fine. And training fund is going to a third party, but notice that the total rate of 56.83, that's the same. Or if you want to pay directly to the worker, those fringe benefits. So we're looking at the basic hourly, plus all the employer payments barring training, that's going directly to the worker. That's also something that you can do, and training fund is going to a third party. But if you're looking at the total for both distributions, both contractors, they're the same. So you're paying nothing less than total hourly rate, and you're also paying nothing less than the basic hourly rate. And we have a quick polling question coming up. So the wage determination shows that there's an increase of $1. But it does not show the distribution. What should a contractor do? Should they put it all into fringes? Should they put it all into basic hourly rates? Or should they contact statistics at dir.ca.gov and request a distribution for the scheduled increase? Okay, so so basically, the put it all into fringes, put it all into basic hourly rates. It depends on the situation, but for laborers, for example, if you review that predetermined increase. So when it comes down to finding out how the distribution specifically is supposed to take effect for a predetermined increase, it's best to reach out to the Office of Policy Research and Legislation. And you can do that by the email that you see in that third answer, statistics. And you can also review the determination. The determination has a phone number that you can reach out to ask about predetermined increases. So you can give that number a call, and you can just have the determination in front of you, specify the county, specify the craft, and specify the determination, and then just ask them, for the distribution, what is the distribution? And you can get the specific distribution for that predetermined increase directly from the Office of Policy Research and Legislation. Next slide, please. So any failure to pay the applicable prevailing wage rate will result in penalties being assessed. So contractors and subcontractors will forfeit not more than $200 for each calendar day of noncompliance. And these penalties will be issued on a civil wage and penalty assessment. Next slide, please. So in addition to registration and payment of the correct prevailing wage rate, contractors also have to meet obligations pertaining to apprenticeship requirements, and we'll be discussing those in the following slides. So we have here a very helpful multi-purpose visual that visualizes and simplifies the various thresholds where prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements initiate. So if you look at the column on the left, it visualizes the various threshold amounts. So when these thresholds are met at the amount specified, requirements will initiate. But keep in mind, we emphasize that this is the main contract and not the subcontract. The middle column specifies the type of work being performed. So this is C for construction, A for demolition, A for alteration, D for demolition, I for installation, R for repair, N for maintenance. And then the third column going from left to right, covers what requirements are applicable at these respective thresholds. So it's important to keep in mind, once again, that we're emphasizing that this is the main contract and not the subcontract. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So there are 3 core apprenticeship requirements that contractors must be aware of. The first is public works contractors must employ apprentices in or at least the minimum ratio. This is 1 apprentice hour to 5 journeyman hours. The contractors are required to also pay the training fund rates to applicable committees or the CAC, and contractors are required to submit contract award notification to all applicable apprenticeship committees. Next slide. This visual demonstrates a total contract amount of $30,000. And as you can see, the contract encompasses all the subcontracts within it. So the fact that the 3rd-tier subcontract does not come close to meeting the $30,000 threshold, that's not relevant. The total contract reaches $30,000. So that means that apprenticeship requirements apply to each of the subcontracts as well as the prime contracts. Next slide, please. So what we have here is a calculation for the minimum apprenticeship ratio. It's a simple calculation that can determine how many apprentice hours are required to meet that minimum ratio. It's best visualized to the 1:5 ratio, 1 apprentice hour to 5 journeyman hours. And the minimum ratio must be met for all apprenticeable classifications. And we see here, number of journeyman hours times 20% is the minimum apprentice hours required. Next slide, please. So here we have a visual. This next diagram will help you visualize how the minimum ratio is calculated when it comes to journeyman hours. Basically, daily straight time less than or equal to 8 hours and weekly straight time less than or equal to 40 hours. That's all included in the ratio calculation for journeyman hours worked. Daily overtime and weekly overtime for hours exceeding 8 hours or 40 hours respectively are not included in that calculation. We can move on to the next slide. The graphic demonstrates journeyman hours for the ratio calculation if work was performed on Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. So the same thresholds still apply, so long as the hours within a day do not exceed 8 hours or within a week do not exceed 40 hours, these journeyman hours are considered into the calculation for minimum ratio. Next slide, please. So apprentice hours work slightly differently. Basically, we're including not only daily and weekly straight time hours into the calculation, but we include the daily and weekly overtime as well to allow contractors to meet that minimum ratio. Next slide. So among the responsibilities that contractors must meet for apprenticeship requirements includes the submission of DS-140 and 142 forms. Here we have a DS-142 form. A DS-142 form is required for any apprenticeable craft when apprenticeship requirements apply. A DS-142 can be sent at any time during the project lifespan, provided there is 72 hours notice. Keep in mind that any notation on the DS-142 form that establishes intent for compliance without hiring apprentices may render the submission invalid. What's important for the perspective of enforcement is that contractors employ apprentices on their projects or at least meet their due diligence by attempting to request registered apprentices. And you can meet your obligation of due diligence by submitting the DS-140 and 142 timely to all applicable programs within the geographic area of your project site. Next slide, please. This visual demonstrates the arithmetic behind the 72-hour notice. So when providing your 72-hour notice on the DS-142 form, in order to be timely, you need to be mindful that Saturday, Sunday, and holiday hours do not count in the 72-hour notice calculation. Next slide, please. Here we have a DS-140. The contractors are required to submit when apprenticeship requirements apply. So this must be filed no later than when the first journeyman is on the project for all apprenticeable crafts to approved apprenticeship programs. The DS-140, for it to be considered valid, must include the following: contractor information, public agency information, project information, and apprentice program information. When it comes to the verification of a valid and timely DS-140 submission, be cognizant of which of the 3 boxes you select as the contractor. If you select box 1, you are saying that you're a signatory to an apprentice program for a particular craft. You'll need to submit DS-140 and 142 to that program for that specified craft to the committee that you're signatory to. However, if you select boxes 2 or 3, you're obligated to submit DS-140 and 142 to all applicable apprentice programs within the geographic area of your project site. One note to add: if you're signatory to a DS-approved apprenticeship program, the program does not dispatch apprentices upon request, you are still required to send the DS-142 to all applicable programs for that apprenticeable craft. Next slide, please. So here we have a helpful visual that explains how requirements are affected based on which box you select on the DS-140 form. So for minimum ratio, you must meet the minimum ratio of 1 apprentice hour to 5 journeyman hours, regardless of which of the boxes that you select. For DS-140, that's the contract award information. If you select box 1, you should send your DS-140 to that applicable apprenticeship program that approved you. For boxes 2 and 3, you send your DS-140 to all applicable apprentice programs within the geographic area of your project site. For maximum ratio, if you select boxes 1 and 2, the requirement may be found under the standards that you've been agreed to be bound by. This is calculated at the end of the project, and it's not applicable if you select box 3. For journeyman on duty, this is applicable if you select box 3. It is not applicable if you select boxes 1 and 2. We will still enforce DS-approved apprenticeship standards. So that's the full visual, and we can move on to the next slide. So here we have some recommended practices for a higher tier contractor. We recommend that you do the following because you're jointly and severally liable for penalties assessed against your subcontractor unless you meet safe harbor provisions under Labor Code 1777.7E. 1 is monitor your contractor's payroll records to ensure apprentices are reported in the correct ratio. 2 is verify training funds were paid for all applicable crafts. And 3, request proof that contract award information was submitted for all contracted work. And we have a quick polling question coming up. So this is something of a pop quiz. I did explain this in a previous slide. If a classification is not apprenticeable, should the work in that classification receive training funds as part of their wages? Yes or no? So yes, when I was discussing the examples of wage determinations, if the craft is not apprenticeable, then training funds should go directly to the worker and not a third party. So keep that in mind. The answer is yes. Okay. So next slide, please. So there are penalties for non-compliance with apprenticeship standards. Contractors shall forfeit not more than $100 for each full calendar day of non-compliance, and contractors shall forfeit not more than $300 for each full calendar day of non-compliance for a second and subsequent violation within a 3-year period. And like the penalties we discussed before, penalties will be issued on a civil wage or penalty assessment. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. So now we're going to be discussing the maintenance and furnishing of payroll records. So we're going to be talking about first the certified payroll records, the physical ones, and how they differ from electronic certified payroll records. And this is pretty much, you know, the concluding portion of this presentation. We can move on to the next slide. So each contractor and subcontractor shall keep accurate payroll records, and the required information should be consistent with the specifications in Labor Code 1776. And for simplicity's sake, we basically, if you receive a written request from us, we expect to see the CPRs furnished on the form called A-1-131 form. This is the Public Works payroll form that's ideal for the written request, mostly because everything you see on that format is specified in Labor Code 1776. You can use an alternative form, that's optional, but it should match the fields that are on the A-1-131 form, because that is the information that we need to conduct a review or an investigation. Next slide, please. So what we have here is an example of what the A-1-131 form looks like. So as specified in Labor Code 1776, contractors need to keep accurate payroll records, which contain the specified information in Labor Code 1776. And once again, this is the A-1-131 form. You can use an alternative form so long as the same fields are represented in that form as in the A-1-131 form. Next slide, please. So here's where we talk about the difference between electronic certified payroll records and eCPRs. So right off the bat, electronic certified payroll records, they're a separate administrative duty. So furnishing electronic certified payroll records, it's a separate administrative duty, and it does not apply for the thresholds that are coming up in red. So $25,000 or less for projects concerning construction, alteration, demolition, installation, or repair work, or $15,000 or less for projects concerning maintenance. So a helpful rule of thumb is when eCPRs are required, then so is registration. And in general, you are required to retain records for certified payroll records for at least 3 years after the completion of the work. Next slide, please. Here we have a polling question. This is just another fact pattern. So a subcontractor receives a request for payroll records from the Labor Commissioner's Office on a public works project. The total project cost of the public works project is $24,000. It's with the city of Fresno, that's the awarding agency, and the prime contractor is to perform renovation in the city of Fresno's facilities department. And we have about 4 polling questions coming up. So 1, is the subcontractor required to pay prevailing wages? 2, should the subcontractor submit electronic certified payroll records? And 3, is the subcontractor required to submit CPRs to the Labor Commissioner's Office? And the last question is, will the subcontractor be subject to 1776H penalties if he does not submit CPRs timely? Okay. So the first one is the subcontractor required to pay prevailing wages. So if you're looking at, again, the total project costs, yes, the subcontractor is required to pay prevailing wages. Should the subcontractor submit certified payroll records? A lot of you answered no. A lot of you answered yes, but the answer is actually no, because this falls under the thresholds that we covered previously for repair. The third question is this contractor required to submit certified payroll records to the Labor Commissioner's Office? So one thing to remember, once again, there's a difference between eCPRs and certified payroll records. eCPRs is a separate administrative duty. When we send a written request, we're asking for certified payroll records, not eCPRs. So you're furnishing on the A-131 form. And yes, if it's coming from the state of California Labor Commissioner's Office, you are required to submit certified payroll records upon that written request. Will the contractor be subject to 1776 penalties if they are not able to submit CPRs timely? Yes. So when you see that written request, like any legal documents, make sure you review it in full, because the time limit that you have will be specified on that written request, as well as any additional instructions and any additional requirements of that request. So make sure once you receive it, you review it, you're on top of it. Otherwise, you may accumulate 1776H penalties for each day it's late. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So in these next few slides, we're going to be talking about the eCPR system. So what you're looking at here is what it looks like for our eCPR, how to get to it. So yeah, so this is, we can move on to the next slide. So I don't know if you can see it on your side, because for me, my presentation is a little bit minimized, but this is what it looks like when you're at the eCPR interface. You can see on the green buttons, you can enter the certified payroll records manually, or you can submit it via XML. These are two different methods, but I'd like to draw your attention to the resources towards the lower left. Those resources basically provide instructions, and they also have visual tutorials on YouTube. They're very helpful in order to understand the process and to avoid making mistakes or clerical errors when entering eCPRs into our system. We can move on to the next slide. So there should be a little finger coming up, but it's going to be pointing to our search function. So once you enter your eCPRs into our system, you can check back by using our search function just to make sure that they're entered properly. And if you look at that little finger, that's basically what you click on to start searching eCPRs in our system. We can move on to the next slide. So this is what our eCPR system looks like. The search, basically you have the criteria, and you can see at the bottom, the date range from and date range to, there are two red asterisks. This means that in order to perform a basic search, you need at least the date range from and to find these eCPR records. Preferably, you want to have the PWCR number, DIR project ID, but at the very least, if you're conducting a basic search, you need those two dates. So once you do that, you click the search button, it'll produce results, but without the date range, you can't even perform a basic search. So these are really helpful tools for you guys as contractors. And when it comes to registration, eCPRs, and even PWC 100, if you have any questions, we recommend that you take screenshots of any issues that you might encounter when using our systems, and submit an inquiry to the Public Works at dir.ca.gov email address. We'll respond to you, and we'll try to help you workshop these issues. But otherwise, this is pretty much the conclusion of my presentation. So if you move on to the next slide, it's going to say thank you. Thank you very much for your interest and taking the time to attend this webinar.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think we have time for one quick question, so I'm going to pass the mic to Joe.
Thanks, Daniela. Thank you, Eric. Question. So in this scenario, is it okay that we are not listed as a subcontractor on the PWC 100 as long as we are able to submit certified payroll? If not, whose responsibility is it to make sure we are on the PWC 100?
So this is probably going to be addressed in the next presentation when I believe Daisy will be going over awarding body responsibilities. But in general, it is up to, or it falls upon the awarding agency to update the PWC 100 entry accordingly. So when they have the full list of subcontractors, ideally you want to revisit the PWC 100 and update it so it shows and reflects all accurate information. As far as the contractor side, when it comes to being subcontracted, like I said, if it's the awarding agency's responsibility, it's kind of out of their control. But if they receive any requests from the state, the Labor Commissioner's office for records or something like that, we would expect to have that, whatever documentation that they have on their side, CPRs, DS-140s, 142 submission, transmission proofs, just to show, or just for a subcontractor to show that they've been doing their best to follow requirements and pay correctly and follow apprenticeship requirements. So yeah, ultimately, long story short, the PWC 100, that falls upon the awarding agency.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eric. Okay, we're going to move on to our last two presentations of the day. They'll be presented by Daisy and Jessica from the Labor Commissioner's Office. Daisy will be covering awarding body responsibilities, and Jessica will cover pre-qualification of contractors. So Daisy, you can take it away.
Thank you, Daniela. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daisy Dvorak. Thank you for staying tuned through the presentations. I'm a Deputy Labor Commissioner in the Public Works Unit. Today, I'm going to talk to you about public works compliance for awarding bodies. Next, please. Okay, just a quick disclaimer. You probably already memorized this, but this is just a summary of relevant law and the Labor Code and California regulations. Any opinions expressed here today are mine only and not necessarily the official position of the Department of Industrial Relations. The information here presented is not to be considered legal advice. Next, please. So I hope we have a few awarding agencies in the audience today. And whether you're a big or a small agency, you at some point will have to award and monitor your own public works project. Maybe you are a school district and need to update some classrooms, or you're a small agency that needs emergency repairs due to water damage. What you all probably will have in common is that you want your project to be successful. And if you're here today, I'm sure you also want to know what you need to do in order to remain in compliance with prevailing wage laws. Well, in the next few slides, we will review compliance requirements for awarding bodies, and we'll also talk about enforcement by the Labor Commissioner's Office. Next, please. So we at the Labor Commissioner's Office understand that you play an important role in making sure that you contract with responsible contractors, and that's why we're here today, to provide you the information and the tools you need to be successful when monitoring your projects. We want to make sure that it's a level playing field for good contractors. So let's go over 9 compliance requirements for awarding bodies. Next, please. Okay, so we have a first question. Let me read it to you. As an awarding body, I play an important role in making sure that only the most responsible contractors are awarded public works contract. So I'll give you a few seconds. Is this true? It's false. I'm not an awarding body. And the results are in, and 64% believe that this is true. I'm glad that, yeah, this is true. You play an important role in making sure that you only contract with responsible contractors. So that's encouraging. Let's move on. Next, please. Okay, so I have another question. You don't have to answer this, just think about it. Let's pretend that I'm an awarding body, right? And I have just awarded a public works project to a contractor. What do you think will be an important next step in the process? So if your answer is register my project with DIR, that's correct. So registering your project with DIR is actually required by the Labor Code. This has to be done within 30 days of the award, but no later than the first day a contractor employs workers on a project. Back in the days, it used to be within 5 days of awarding the project. Luckily, we now have 30 days to complete this process, which I'll walk you through in the next few slides. Where a contract is awarded in bona fide emergency, penalties shall not be assessed against an awarding body so long as the required information is submitted within 15 days of the first day work was performed on the project. So it's important to note that it must be transmitted electronically using DIR project registration system, which some of you might be familiar with. It's formerly known as PWC 100. If you have any questions during the registration of your project, please reach out to us. Our email is publicworks@dir.ca.gov. I cannot stress enough the importance of registering your project with DIR. I know this is another thing to remember, it's an extra step, but the contractor, the system is going to generate a project registration ID number. And this number is going to be, the contractors are going to need this number in order to submit their electronic certified payroll record as required. So as you can imagine, if an awarding body fails to register a project, they're not only potentially would be subject to penalties themselves, but they're also going to be precluding that contractor from being in compliance with DIR. The project registration requirement does not apply to projects of $25,000 or less when the project is for construction, alteration, demolition, installation, or repair work, or for projects of $15,000 or less when the project is for maintenance work. And you have to keep in mind that we're talking about the total amount of the project. We're not talking of specific, subcontract agreements, but the total amount of the project. So if it's above the $25,000 or the $15,000 threshold. Awarding bodies can, one thing I forgot to mention is that the contractors are, even though the amount might fall under this monetary threshold, the contractors are still required to pay prevailing wages, and they're still required to maintain certified payroll records. Awarding bodies can register a master agreement to comply with notice requirement. You don't need to report individual task orders. The law, however, does not allow jobs to be parceled out in order to avoid prevailing wage requirements. Next, please. Okay, so let's walk through the process of registering a project. In this slide, you will see a screenshot of our public works section on our website. You have two ways to get to the project registration section. You can either click on the blue rectangle that says awarding bodies, or you can click on project registration, that link under the registration on your right-hand side. Next, please. So on this screen, you would either sign in if you've already created an account, or if you're a first-time user, you're gonna have to select first-time user. If you forgot your password, just click on forgot password and we'll reset it for you. If you have any issues during this section, please reach out to us. Maybe you are unable to retrieve your password, or you've created a new account and you are not linked to your agency, please email us. We'll help you with that. Next, please. So this is the section where you're going to enter the general contractor or subcontractor information. I suggest before you begin the registration of your project is that you gather some information, such as you're going to need the name of the prime contractor, the name of the subcontractors, their registration numbers. For your project, you're going to need names. You're going to need the name of the project, the dates, costs, and location. Excuse me, if any of the information you entered during the registration changes, all you have to do is log back into your account and you can select an update to update your project registration. It's a very easy process. Next, please. Once you're done registering your project, it will automatically be assigned a project registration ID number. And this is the number that you're going to be providing contractors so that they can file their electronic certified payroll records. You can search your project registration by clicking on Find Public Works Projects on the right-hand side. Next, please. So the public can also search for public works projects by entering information on any of these fields. If, for example, you do a search by awarding body name, you might need to enter more specific information, or the system will let you know that there are over 250 results and that you need to narrow your search. So this is probably going to be true for agencies that have several public works projects registered with DIR. Next, please. So this is how the results will look like. If you want to see more information about a project, all you need to do is click on the project ID number, which is the only active link, and it will take you to information for that specific project. Next, please. Okay, moving on to compliance requirement number 2. I briefly mentioned this, but basically awarding bodies are not to split projects to avoid registration or prevailing wage requirements. Next, please. So as an awarding body, it is important that you ensure that all your contractors are registered. As of January 1st, 2018, all contractors and subcontractors must be registered to bid or work on a public works project, regardless of when the contract was awarded. Now, the registration requirement for contractors does not apply to projects of $25,000 or less when the project is for construction, alteration, demolition, installation, or repair work, or for projects of $15,000 or less when the project is for maintenance work. So, so the exemption is the same as for the project registration and the contractor registration. And remember that we're looking at the total amount of the project, not individual subcontracts. Again, you know, the contractor is still required to pay prevailing wages, and they're still required to maintain certified payroll records. Next, I believe we have a question coming up. Okay, so a public works project has been awarded in the total amount of $40,000. One subcontractor on the project has an agreement for $15,000 to do demolition. Is this subcontractor required to be registered as a public works contractor to bid or work on this project? You have 3 options. A, no need for this contractor to be registered. The amount of the subcontract is less than $25,000. Yes, the subcontractor needs to register because the total amount of the project is over $25,000 threshold. And C, I just tell everyone that they need to register. So I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, I see 87% say yes, this subcontractor needs to register. And that is correct. You know, the total amount of the project is $40,000 above the monetary threshold, so they do need to be registered. All right, let's move on. This is a screenshot of our Public Works Contractor Registration Database. It has changed over time, but you can now search by legal name, CSLB number, DBA registration number. You can export information, you can create a list, you can even do a search by the craft you need. It's very user-friendly. I suggest you bookmark this page for easy access. Registrations expire every June 30th. These are good for fiscal year. And you need to make sure that your contractors remain registered throughout the life of your project to avoid penalties or delay. Next, please. So this is just what a search result will look like. If in doing your due diligence, you discover that you either have an unregistered contractor bidding on a public works project, or you already have a project, but your contractor has an expired registration, please let the contractor know so that they can renew their registration. And if they refuse to comply, let us know, contact us to report the issue. Next, please. Another important requirement for all awarding bodies is to include notice of requirements as described in Labor Code 1771. This notice is to be included in all bid invitations and public works contracts. Next, please. Number 5, the Labor Code requires that awarding bodies obtain prevailing wage rates from DIR. Luckily, now we have them all online and they're all easy to access. If you or your contractor need help with this section, please contact DIR for further assistance. Next, please. So another important requirement for awarding bodies is to post or to require the contractors to post all the required job site notices on their projects. Many times, this is important because many times workers are unaware that they're working on a public works project and that they're entitled to prevailing wages. These notices will make sure that they know that they're working on a public works project and they know their rights when working on a public works project. Next, please. As an awarding body, you are also tasked with making sure the contractors are paying prevailing wages and that they're in compliance with public works laws. Many awarding agencies do this by asking their contractors to provide payroll records. If in reviewing these records, you discover or you suspect violations, report them to the Labor Commissioner's office. Our public works complaint can be found online, and anyone can file a public works complaint. Prevailing wages are not required on projects of $1,000 or less. Not sure what you can get done nowadays for $1,000 or less, so I'm guessing this is not a very common situation. Next, please. In the event, we issue what's called the civil wage and penalty assessment against the contractor on one of your public works projects. You're required to withhold and retain all amounts necessary to satisfy the assessment. Our office will serve you, the awarding agency, a copy of this document, and you can contact the assigned deputy if you have any questions regarding the assessment and the money being retained. Next, please. Now let's talk about enforcement. New legislation, specifically SB 96, provided new enforcement mechanisms for the Labor Commissioner to enforce public works contractor registration requirements. So what happens was we had the requirements for contractor to register with DIR, but we had no way to enforce it. SB 96 not only created penalties for contractors who fail to register, but also it also establishes penalties for awarding and sanctions for awarding bodies that hire or allow unregistered contractors to work on public works projects. And this is because you're in a unique position to ensure that unregistered contractors are not employed on your projects. Next, please. The Labor Code 1773.3 provides that penalties can be assessed against awarding bodies for 3 specific violations. Not registering their project within 30 days of the award, entering into a contract with an unregistered contractor. Remember that contractors need to be registered in order to bid on a public works project, and allowing an unregistered contractor to work on a public works project. So contractors must have an active registration throughout the life of the project, right? An awarding body is subject to penalties of $100 per day in violation of either of these requirements, not to exceed an aggregate penalty of $10,000 per project. Next, please. Penalties can also be assessed when final payment has been made and it is later discovered that an unregistered contractor worked on the project. An awarding body is required to withhold final payment until at least 30 days after all the required information has been submitted through the project registration database, including a complete list of all the subcontractors. And penalties can be assessed for each full calendar day of noncompliance for up to 100 days for each unregistered contractor or subcontractor, with a maximum of $10,000 per unregistered contractor. So you can see how these penalties can add up pretty quickly. Next, please. If the Labor Commissioner determines that an awarding body has committed 2 or more willful violations within a 1-year period, the awarding body will be ineligible to receive state funding or any other financial assistance for any construction projects for a period of 1 year. Excuse me, I am confident that none of the agencies in the audience today are going to find themselves in this situation. I hope that we're providing the tools and the resources in order to remain in compliance. And of course, if you have any questions, reach out to us, give us a call or email us, and we'll be happy to help. Next, please. The Labor Commissioner can also issue a stop order against the contractor or subcontractor who is unregistered. The workers of that unregistered contractor are entitled to be paid for a period of up to 10 days while they're not permitted to work. The stop order is only for the unregistered contractor, but as you can imagine, it can potentially interfere with the work of other registered contractors and might cause delays to your project. Failure to observe the stop order is a misdemeanor. Next, please. And this is my last slide, just to remind you that Labor Code 1777 establishes a criminal penalty for violations of any provision of Article 2 of the Labor Code. Next, please. Okay, so this concludes my my presentation for awarding bodies. I believe there's some time after the presentations for questions. And next, I have my colleague, Jessica Santisteban. She's going to be talking about pre-qualification of contractors. Jessica?
Thank you, Daisy, and good afternoon, everyone. Hope you have all enjoyed the webinar so far. We are at the very end of it now, but before we let you go, now that you have heard all about awarding body compliance requirements and enforcement, we did want to take a moment to talk to you about something that all awarding bodies should definitely be taking advantage of, and that is the pre-qualification of contractors. This is a tool that will not only help awarding bodies meet some of those requirements that Daisy just covered, it's also a great preventative measure tool that will allow awarding bodies to be proactive and not only be able to identify, but more importantly, be able to prevent problems from arising. We could move on to the next slide. This is our disclaimer. You've been hearing it all morning long, so we'll go ahead and skip through it. Just keep in mind that it does also apply to this presentation. Next slide, please. We are going to start with a poll question, just to get an idea of where awarding bodies are as far as the pre-qualification of contractors. So the poll question reads, as an awarding body, do you currently have a pre-qualification of contractors system in place? And you could go ahead and mark A for yes or B for no. And we'll just give you a few seconds to answer that. And I have to say, I have been pleasantly surprised with the poll results throughout the webinars this year. So this being the last one of the year, I hope we see good numbers here. Okay, so awesome. It looks like 71% of you do have a pre-qualification of contractor system in place. So for those of you that have a system in place, thank you for doing your part in leveling the playing field for law-abiding contractors. For those of you that do not have a system in place, we hope that after today's presentation, you are able to recognize the importance and the benefits of pre-qualifying contractors, and that you are able to see how easily you too can adopt a pre-qualification of contractor system. Our goal is for the pre-qualification of contractors to just become the norm for awarding bodies, which is why we do take time during these webinars to educate awarding bodies about the pre-qualification of contractors, because we want to ensure that all awarding bodies are taking advantage of this great tool that is available to them. Next slide, please. For those of you that are not familiar with the pre-qualification of contractors, a quick overview. Under Public Contract Code Section 20101, awarding bodies do have the authority to pre-qualify licensed contractors for the right to bid on public works projects. So the purpose of pre-qualifying is to make sure that bad actors are stopped before a contract is awarded and that repeat violators do not continue to profit from wage theft. I am going to be covering the Labor Commissioner's Model Questionnaire with you today. It's a complete pre-qualification packet that can easily be adopted and customized to an awarding body's needs. So whether you are looking to adopt a system for the very first time, or you're looking to enhance whatever system you have in place, you are able to use this great model questionnaire. Next slide. There are a lot of great benefits to pre-qualifying contractors. Some of the ones we want to highlight for you today are that by pre-qualifying, an awarding body does have the ability to evaluate both the competency and the integrity of bidders. What that means is that a awarding body can pre-qualify a contractor based on that contractor's financial strength, their qualifications, their experience with the law, and their experience in general. And so what that does is limit the receipt of bids only from responsible bidders and makes the bidding process much more efficient for awarding bodies. That then results in construction of public works projects of the highest quality, because you will be awarding contracts to contractors of the highest quality. And what that will do is provide a more level playing field for law-abiding contractors, which I'm sure we can all agree the law-abiding contractors are the ones that we want to continue to see get these public works projects awarded. And we want to see them out on these public works job sites. Next slide, please. Another great benefit of pre-qualifying is that it's a great preventative measure tool, not only to ensure that contractors are registered and to avoid any stop orders being issued. It's also a great preventative measure tool to avoid awarding body citations and debarment. So Daisy just covered those citations with you. You were able to see that the citations can add up fairly quickly. So as an awarding body, you want to make sure you're being proactive and that you are doing everything that you can to avoid any of those citations being issued to you. Because again, those citations can ultimately result in an awarding body debarment, which is again, something that you want to avoid. Next slide. So the Labor Commissioner Model Questionnaire that I mentioned is available for all awarding bodies to use. The great thing about this questionnaire is that it was not only approved by the Labor Commissioner, it was created by staff in the California Labor Commissioner's office, and the questions in the questionnaire are directly related to the Labor Commissioner's enforcement objectives. As I mentioned, it's a complete pre-qualification packet, so it's everything that you need to either adopt a system for the first time or enhance what you have in place. It includes everything from instructions to the awarding bodies, to the questionnaire itself, of course. It also includes a scoring worksheet that you would need for additional scrutiny, and I will cover that briefly in the next slide. And it even includes sources for verification of information given by the contractor. So again, it's a complete packet and it's everything that you would need in order to adopt a system for the first time, if that's what you're looking to do. Next slide, please. The model questionnaire was broken down into 3 easy steps. And the great thing about this questionnaire is also that it's a great time-saving tool, because you can quickly either pre-qualify or disqualify a contractor, leaving additional scrutiny only to those questionable contractors. So here, as you can see in step 1, a contractor that wishes to be pre-qualified would submit the complete pre-qualification questionnaire along with financial statements to the awarding body for review. At this point, the contractor would also provide any additional information or documentation that is requested from them by the awarding body. As I mentioned earlier, the questionnaire can be customized to an awarding body's needs. So the awarding body is able to make any adjustments as they see fit for their projects. So once the contractor submits all the required documentation to the awarding body can then move on to step 2, which is to review section C, the essential criteria questions. There are a total of 13 yes or no questions in this section. If any answers to questions 1 through 6 is no, or any answers to questions 7 through 13 is yes, that contractor is actually immediately disqualified. And just to give you an idea of one of the questions in the section, question number 2 reads, is your firm registered with DIR as a public works contractor for the current fiscal year? So if a contractor answers no to that question, they would actually be immediately disqualified. So if a contractor is not immediately disqualified based on the answers they provide in section C, then the awarding body can assume that that contractor has passed this section, and they can then move on to step 3, which is to review section D, the pre-qualification criteria questions. So there are a total of 21 questions broken up into 4 different categories in section D. The 4 categories are 1, prior history, 2, criminal matters and civil suits, 3, occupational health and safety compliance, and 4, prevailing wage and apprenticeship compliance. So the questions are answered on a scale of 0 to 5+. If the contractor answers 0 to all 21 questions, that contractor can then be immediately pre-qualified. If a contractor for some reason does not answer 0 to all 21 questions, then that is when the awarding body would have to conduct additional scrutiny. So what the awarding body would do is gather the documentation or information that was provided by the contractor for those specific questions, and they would use a scoring worksheet that is provided with the questionnaire to determine whether or not that contractor can be pre-qualified. So those are the 3 easy steps to the pre-qualification process. This brings us to our next poll question. And so hopefully with this poll question, you are able to get a better understanding of some of the information I just provided, or at least a visual of some of that information. What you see here is page 1 of section C, the essential criteria questions, and marked on here are answers provided by a contractor. So based on the answers provided by the contractor on page 1 of section C, would you assume the contractor has passed this pre-qualification section? And you could go ahead and mark A for yes or B for no. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, awesome. So 89% of you said no, and you are correct. The answer is no, and that is based on the answers provided for questions number 2 and number 7. So based on these 2 answers alone, the contractor would be immediately disqualified. So this is also a great example of how easy a contractor that is either currently not in compliance or has not been in compliance in the past can be easily disqualified during this pre-qualification process. The next poll question, next slide, is based on section F of the questionnaire, which is the certification page. And this certification page would be signed by the contractor upon completion of the questionnaire. They would be signing this under penalty of perjury. So based on the information provided on the certification page you see here, if a contractor makes a false statement in the questionnaire, what 3 things may that result in? A, disqualification from registering as a public works contractor with DIR, having penalties assessed and grounds for being debarred. B, disqualification from bidding on any public works project, registering as a public works contractor with DIR, and grounds for termination of a public works contract, or C, none of the above. And the answer again is right on the certification page. So hopefully we've made it fairly easy for you. Okay, so 60% of you said B, which is the correct answer. So as you can see on the certification page on that bottom portion of it, a contractor would be signing under penalty of perjury that the information provided in the questionnaire is true, full, and correct. And they would also be signing that they understand making a false statement may result in disqualification from bidding on any public works project, registering as a public works contractor with DIR, and could also be grounds for termination of a public works contract. So great job with those poll questions, everybody. Next slide, please. So the Labor Commissioner Model Questionnaire is available, like I said, for all awarding bodies to use, and you are able to find it on our Public Works homepage on our website. It would be the very first link under resources. Once you click on that, it'll take you to the next page, which is the next slide, where you will find a brief summary of the Public Works pre-qualification of contractors, And you will also find here links to the questionnaire packet in both a PDF format, a Word format, and then you will also find a link to that scoring worksheet that I mentioned is needed for the additional scrutiny. So if you haven't had the chance to review the Labor Commissioner Model Questionnaire packet in detail, I do highly recommend that you go onto our website and take a look at it. That actually concludes my portion of the presentation. But I just want to say that as an awarding body, you do have the authority to pre-qualify contractors for the right to bid on public works projects. So why not take advantage of that authority? So we just ask that you make that individual commitment to help level the playing field for law-abiding contractors by adopting a pre-qualification of contractors system today. So that concludes the presentation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Daisy and Jessica. For the remainder of our time, we're going to have a Q&A session answering more of your questions on all of the topics you just listened to. So if you guys have any questions, please submit them now through the Q&A box. And if any of the presenters have a common question they want to address, feel free to jump in. And with that said, I'm going to pass it back to Joe.
Thank you so much, Daniela. All right. I know we got through a lot of these questions in the chat. We have a few left here, so I'll put these out, and whoever would like to field them will be great. All right, so first question, if we have a job that's privately funded but located on state-owned property, does that project need to be registered?
Okay, this is Daisy. I'll take that. So with that additional information, if the project has been determined that it's a public works project, it needs to be registered with the Department of Industrial Relations.
Thanks, Daisy. Next question. I understand that ECPRs are not required on jobs that are under an acceptable or approved labor agreement. How do I determine if a labor agreement is acceptable or not?
Hi, this is Lorna. You have to check that with the awarding body if PLA is part of that public works project. We wouldn't have that information at the Labor Commissioner's office.
Great, thank you, Lorna. Okay, next we have a scenario question. If a subcontractor will be using an electrician, a laborer, and cement mason for their project, could they face any penalties for sending out their DAS forms before the specific trade is started on site? So for example, if they send out cement mason and laborer DAS forms before any of their work is started, then are they in compliance? But if they send out their electrician DAS form after their labor and masonry work is started, but before the electrical work starts, will they receive any penalties if audited?
Hello, everybody. This is Fabian. So the DAS forms, there is no penalty if you submit them prior to the first day that they start working. And so these DAS forms are due based on the classification. So there would, if you're, let's say, for example, if you're employing 3 or 4 classifications and they're all starting at different times, they wouldn't be all due on the same day. So the DAS 140 forms would be due no later than the first day of working, which that classification began working. So if all these different classifications begin working on separate days, then each one is going to have a different deadline. But to answer the question, there wouldn't be any penalties if you were to submit it early. The penalties would come when they're untimely or they were just never submitted at all.
Great, thank you very much, Fabian. Okay, up next, the entire contract amount. Is this referring to the contract amount between the general contractor and the subcontractor?
So no, the amounts that we're talking about, the monetary thresholds, it's not between the prime contractor, the subcontractor. What we're referring to is the overall cost of the project. So when we're talking about the 1530, I mean the 15 and $25,000 threshold, It's not between an agreement between subcontractors or prime and a sub. It's the overall cost of the project. So it's whatever the awarding body awards. So for example, if the awarding body were to award a project for $5 million, then it wouldn't meet the small project exemption, right? Even though maybe a subcontractor had a subcontract agreement with another contractor for, let's say, 10,000, right? We're looking at the overall cost of the project, and it's not based on subcontract agreements.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Next question. On the prevailing wage rates, there are groups. Can you talk a little bit about what that signifies?
Hello, this is Norbert. So some classifications do have groups. For example, you have the laborers in Southern California, and another one would be the operating engineers. So when you look at the prevailing wage determination, there usually is more than one page when there is groups involved. There's different sub-trades under the labor classification that fall under different groups. And you have to look at page 2 on the prevailing wage determination to determine what is the work that is being performed. I'm looking at a determination right now, and I'm looking at group 4, labor. And just for this conversation, they have pipe layer listed under that. So if your labor pipe layer would fall under group 4, and that's the rate that they would be paid under.
Great. Thank you, Norbert. Okay, it looks like we have just a few more. Around per diem rates, can we talk a little bit about when per diem, what scenario, in which scenarios they're to be paid and how those are paid?
I'll answer that as well. This is Norbert again. Same thing when you're looking at a prevailing wage determination, you have the basic hourly rate, and then you have the per diem rates. What I don't know if you're referring to, if the person asking the question is referring to fringe benefits. When you look at the determination, next to the basic hourly rate, you have health and welfare, pension, vacation and holiday, the training, other, and the other amount. So those other amounts have to be paid either to the worker, not the training portion. The training portion either goes to the CAC or an applicable apprentice committee, or if the trade is not apprenticeable, then it can be paid to the worker. But all that is part of the portion that would go to the worker or to an approved third party.
And Norbert, if I may add to something to that. So we can't really have a blanket answer for this because each wage determination has different rates, right? And so you're really gonna have to look at the other requirements on our website, depending on where the county, or actually where the work is taking place. There may be some travel subsistence, the per diem, where you may have to pay a worker depending on the amount of time that they traveled. So you want to look at all those provisions. And we can't really get into one specific one because all these wage determinations are so different. But I would just suggest that not only to look at the basic hourly rate and the total hourly rate, but there's also sections there on each wage determination that may have travel and subsistence requirements.
Thank you very much. Next question, who do I contact to get a determination on whether or not the project has to follow prevailing wage laws? We've been asked to keep prevailing wage reports, but did not have any information on the awarding agency or DIR project numbers.
I would recommend that you reach out to the director's office. Isaac, who had the presentation earlier, and his colleagues, they handle all the questions in regards to whether a specific type of work is considered a public work. They may also have information about clarification on the specific type of work that's being performed, exactly what classification to use. And so I know Isaac gave out his number earlier. I would also suggest that maybe you can email pwcoverage@dir.ca.gov. And so if you have any questions about whether a specific type of work is considered a public works covered work, then you would contact the director's office. I know again, I believe Isaac provided his phone number, but you can also email again pwcoverage@dir.ca.gov as well.
Thank you very much. Next question is just to clarify. So engineer work would still need to be paid prevailing wage, even if there was no work done on the site.
So the question really is more about whether the specific type of work is covered. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be done on site, but really what you have to look at is whether the specific type of work that's being performed is considered a public work. And so again, we would rely on the director's office to give us information about whether this specific type of work would be considered public work or not. Whether it's on-site or off-site, that may play a role in it, but that's something that we would have to clarify with the director's office. And again, I would encourage you to reach out to them, either Isaac or pwcoverage@dir.ca.gov.
Great, thank you. Up next, there are groups in the construction inspection determination, but they are not descriptive and there's nothing in the scope of work. How do you figure out which group an employee belongs in?
This is Lorna. That's a question that you may want to pose to the Office of Policy Research and Legislation, who we in the Labor Commissioner's Office contact when there's a gray area about the specific scope of work performed on public works projects.
Thank you very much. Up next, we have a question. If the project was not located on the DIR website, how does the reporting get reported?
Well, you wouldn't, as a contractor, you wouldn't be able to report it, which is why Daisy emphasized the importance of project registration, right? Because if you as a contractor are working on a project and the awarding body hasn't registered it, there's no way that you would be able to upload these ECPRs onto the website. So if you're a contractor, and you're trying to upload ECPRs and you don't have that project ID, you can always reach out to the awarding body and see if there's anything going on about, well, actually, I would just remind them to register the project. If for some reason, they're just not registering it, I would encourage you to reach out to the Labor Commissioner's Office, because that is a requirement that awarding bodies have to fulfill if the project is not meeting the small project exemption. So it's very important, like Daisy emphasized, it's important because it has repercussions on contractors when contractors are trying to comply with uploading these ECPRs. Without that project ID, the contractors really just can't do that. And so if you as a contractor don't have that project ID and you haven't been able to get any information from the awarding body, you can always reach out to us. Our email address is publicworks, one word. So it's publicworks@dir.ca.gov. Once again, it's publicworks@dir.ca.gov. So if you run into any situation like that, you can always reach out to us.
Very good, thank you. Up next, should an awarding body request electrician certifications for all workers conducting electrical work on a public works project.
So this is David Cross. You'd really need to reach out to our electrical certification unit and look at the requirements on that particular portion of our website page to determine that answer. Certainly not all electrical work performed by inside wiremen would require certified electricians, but we can't answer that question without knowing more details, such as the specific details about what size and of wiring that they're handling and that kind of thing. But the electrical certification unit has some descriptions in the frequently asked questions portion, which gives details about when electrical certification is required.
Very good. Thank you, David. With regards to ECPRs, do you have to upload ECPRs or can you keep paper records?
So those are two separate requirements. So one doesn't substitute the other. If the project does not meet the small project exemption, then contractors are required to upload ECPRs onto our website, but also maintain a hard copy. And so those are two different requirements. And, you know, I guess to answer the question is, yes, they would have to upload the ECPRs, but also maintain hard copies of the certified payroll records. The certified payroll records under Labor Code Section 1776, they have different requirements than the ones that are uploaded on ECPRs. And so it's important for all contractors to understand that these are two separate requirements that they have to comply with.
Perfect. Thanks, Fabian. I think that was the last question we have. So that concludes this prevailing wage webinar co-hosted by California Labor Commissioner's Office and Labor Management Compliance Council. Thank you again for joining us, and a special thank you to Susan, Lorna, Fabian, Norbert, and all of today's presenters, Isaac, Lance, David, Eric, Daisy, and Jessica, as well as everyone behind the scenes. Please don't forget to fill out the post-webinar survey that will appear once this webinar ends. We look forward to hearing from all of you. Have a great day, everyone.